Today's guest is a writer, illustrator, IT specialist, and a former investigator for the Center for UFO Studies. In his book X Descending, he investigates Ray Stanfords UFO film recordings and the Paul Benowitz case. A big Koit welcome to Christian Lambright. Hello Christian, welcome to KoitCast.
Hi Koit, how are you?
I am super lush, thank you. By the way, thanks ever so much for being here. It's much appreciated. So I suppose the question which I always ask to everyone is always, tell us who you are, how would you describe yourself, etc., etc.
My name is Christian Lambright. Getting older these days, I've been at this topic for a long time. Most of my friends are up there as well. I tend to ask a lot of questions. I think sometimes I tend to aggravate people because I will double check everything. I mean, to me, I don't count myself as a scientist, but I've been through plenty of that. And I have friends who are. And falsifiability is one of the basic precepts of science is, can you disprove it as much as can you prove it? So I tend to at least question everything. And sometimes, especially these days, I have a degree in psychology. My father's a psychiatrist, so I think I come across the idea of examining people's beliefs and attitudes just second nature to me now. But you probably are as aware as anyone that people tend to believe whatever suits them. And if they're presented with something contrary to that, well, that's just your truth, or that's your belief. It's a shame that people don't go down easily when it comes to something that they believe in, especially when they've been at it for a long time. It's like the old joke about people who don't want to turn around 50 miles, they've gone the wrong way, but they've gone so far, they don't want to turn around and back up. And that happens psychologically, I think, with people. But anyway, that's the basics of who I am. If anything else you want to know, let me know.
First off, I agree with you on that, by the way. People can tend to get very defensive, and then that they sit into a position rather than being open to understanding why not, or why a different path. So yeah, I'm with you on that, which leads me into my first question, which is, or just preamble it, I was going to say, I like your approach on the subjects because you bring a no-nonsense approach, which is what I like. It's sort of like the scientific method of investigation, if you will. So the first main question would be, with the population at large, why does belief take a more dominant position rather than facts, would you say?
Well, if you look historically, people have, before the topic of UFOs ever existed, you can go back to all sorts of things as religion and politics and everything else. And you'll find that quite often people don't even stop and ask themselves why they believe certain things. We're easily led. There was a great article that came out not too long ago by a gentleman who said, we have no real free will. And he looked at the way we're brought up historically, things that we're taught, the culture that we're in, and you realize so many of the things that you think you're deciding on are influenced even subconsciously and otherwise by the culture you're in, the beliefs of the culture that you're in. And I think also people need hope, something to believe in, is the way it's often put. And personally, if a person's beliefs help them and they don't hurt anyone else, leave it alone. If a kid wants to believe in Santa Claus, what's the harm? He'll learn soon enough. I don't think there's any reason to challenge somebody's beliefs if it's a personal belief that actually helps them, which I think is the greatest thing about religions, or I like the idea of religion. I would say people who have faith, and it's a faith that should be good towards other people. But these days we have influencers, we have people who want to believe that they're doing something important. And I'm acutely aware, especially as we get older, that we want to feel that we've not wasted our efforts and that we've not misled ourselves along the way. And we tend to lock down our beliefs even more. But that's the trouble. There are good beliefs and there are bad beliefs. People begin. Also, I think it's a shame that people aren't open to having their beliefs contested, or at least examined, because what happens is, like you indicated, people tend to not like what they hear if it's not going along with what they want to hear or want to believe, and they shut that person out, or they shut out that conversation. And as too often happens with Facebook and other places online, you can very easily find places where people who believe what you want to believe are there, and eventually you're not getting anything else except fed back your own belief. Unfortunately, I think that could apply to just about every scientist as well, who don't want to believe in UFOs. And if you believe a certain way, you end up gravitating towards people who have common minds. And then everybody doubles down on it. Now, all you're really learning or hearing is reinforcing your own belief. It's the difference, I think, between a real skeptic and an open-minded scientist. Unfortunately, I've seen it happen that people become afraid of either losing their sense of credibility, even in science, and instead of stopping to examine first, they just stop all conversation with a certain person because somebody else said that person may or may not be credible based on something that has nothing to do with the evidence. I mean, I'm speaking of a personal experience on that one.
Sure.
But anyway.
Well, I get the sentiment. It is the old, if you find yourself in an echo chamber, you'll never get out because you're hearing what you want to hear rather than what is there.
Exactly.
And you said something pertinent earlier, which is your truth versus the truth. I think there is only the truth, and we should all strive towards that. But hey, that's a wishful thinking thing, isn't it?
No, but you're right. But it gets difficult as well, because even in science, I think it was Einstein and some other ones who said perception is reality. Well, then wait. If everybody's perception is based on what they believe, and of course that's the truth of it all, is it all our perception filters through what we are expecting or what we want to see. It makes it difficult. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to resolve, but
well, that's what I was going to ask you that next. Then, from a psychological perspective, how do you unbrainwash the brainwashed? And I say that flippantly, but you know what I mean. Once you're entrenched in a position, how can we get people out of that to be open to other ideas?
Boy, that's the quintessential question.
Mm.
It's funny because it brings to mind something that my father told me a long time ago. As I said, he was a psychiatrist. He actually began as a medical doctor. I grew up in Indonesia. We were missionaries, and he came back and became a psychiatrist. But when I was in school, one time I asked him, I said, Dad, are there times people come to talk to you and you can pretty quickly tell what the problem is? And he said, oh, sure. I guess enough experience, you can kind of tell what the problem. He said, but more often than not, they put such a fine lid on it, and that lid is all that's holding them together, that you can't just tear the lid off and tell them what the problem is. Often they'll say you're full of it, and they'll walk out, and then you haven't helped them at all.
Mm.
That's why I think in therapy, the idea is more often than not, eventually the patient thinks they've figured it out themselves because they've sat there conversing long enough. And of course, I will say there's the likelihood that you're going to a therapist or a psychiatrist. You're already aware of the fact that you're going to him to figure this out. So you're going to speak a lot more freely because he's not there to counter you. He's there to listen. And I think we all know one of the famous things that are most popular things therapists often ask people is, how does that make you feel? Not how does it make you think? Or what did you think about that? Is how did you feel? Because at the end of the day, even beliefs, when people get angry, we've all had friends that when you struck a nerve because suddenly their voice gets higher and they start getting angry and arguing. And right there, that's where the problem is. But I think it's important to be able to be willing to listen and not have them think that you're being combative. But then first thing to do is to get them to sit there and be willing to converse and talk to you about it. And that's the tough part.
I think you're 100% right. It is that willingness to listen, I think. I mean, I've been through the process myself. Years ago, I went to a hypnotherapist because I was going through some level of anxiety at the time. I'm easily out of it now. But all that hypnotherapist did was help me to come up with a key to the answer, That was it. That's what they lead you to someplace.
First time I was separated years ago, and I realized it was messing with my head. And so I went and found someone to speak with as well. What surprised me was the first hour, I talked about something had nothing to do, I don't go into it, had nothing to do with the marriage. But when I walked out of there, so many things suddenly began to make sense because I realized how much baggage I had brought into with myself that was never expressed. But that's the difficult part, is getting people, they say, look, see yourself in a mirror, getting people to be willing to stop and actually examine why they feel the way they do and what their beliefs are, and not just react, out of anger and wanting to hit back, so to speak.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, I agree. It's a shame we can't all have some of it.
Oh, especially now in the world we see nowadays, like you said, it's exacerbated by social media, but everything's becoming so polarized or divisive. We need to come back together and somehow. And I just think it's based on that key, which is willingness. Come
Yeah.
forward yourself. But hey ho, let's move on from that straight into the good stuff, the meat and the potatoes. So in your book, X Descending, you investigated two scenarios that intrigued me a lot, and I said that in my email to you. And the first of these was the Ray Stanford videos. Now I've heard
Mhm.
about these across the years many, many times, but I think you've got a lot of information that I will not be privy to. So can you tell us who is Ray Stanford and what did he record?
All right. Let me make one clarification first. You said Ray
Okay.
Stanford's videos.
Ah.
These are films. These are actual films, not video.
Oh.
In other words, oh yeah. So you've got however many frames of film. And obviously, if it's on film in that particular case, it's something that's a lot more specific. It's not as easy, but Ray's material is film. Um, Ray's probably one of the most unique individuals that I've ever met. I think I tried to spell that out in my book. Um, he is well, he's who he was. He started out years before I was. I think he's getting on up there now, and I mean he's not as sharp as he used to be, and none of us are. But he got interested in this stuff when he was a child, like so many of us did. And somewhere along the way, Ray's an interesting mix between a scientific, critical, analytical mind, probably some of the sharpest visual acuity of anyone that I've ever known, the ability to see things that are there. I mean, when most people, I think that's one of the successes that he's had in paleontology. So he's, got multiple interests that he's got going on. Is but he's been able to walk along in areas where people said there was nothing, and something intuitively or otherwise, he'll see something that looks different or strikes his mind a certain way. Sure enough, he's made some paleontological discoveries in Maryland, just walking streams where other experts said there was nothing. And now he's got displays in the Smithsonian and other places with his name on it because he's proved the point that he simply has the mindset and the acuity, or maybe it's intuition, whatever you want to call it. But somewhere along the way, he was a twin as well. I'm thinking that probably
Ah.
makes people
Yeah.
unique. Yeah, his brother Rex unfortunately passed away not long ago. But anyway, Ray got interested in the topic. He and his brother did for a long time, moved years going different places. And I'm not saying way back in the 50s and 60s. That was an interesting time in our country as well.
Mm.
Um, Ray was very involved in starting an association for the understanding of man, where I don't know how to term it these days. I think a lot of people might call it doing psychic readings. I don't know that he called it that. But then again, so much of what we hear these days coming out of Bigelow's Institute for Consciousness Studies, and even some of the people that have considered top names out there now are looking at the importance of consciousness in a lot of things. But Ray also was interested in the UFO side of it. He started a project and I'm probably skipping over a lot of his early years that I don't know enough about to really speak about. But he started a project when he was down in Austin called Project Starlight International, PSI, which I I studied parapsychology when I was at Baylor, but the whole idea of psi, which carries kind of a dual connotation or dual
That's
meaning to
right.
it. But his focus in Austin was instrumented research. He had several people working with him. He built a facility outdoors. They had cameras, telescopes, a laser that they would use at times. And I know one time that comes to mind when apparently they were able to bounce that laser off the side of what the object they were looking at was. And he had a kind of a interesting setup around town where if something was seen, I believe it was automatic calls would go out on the phone to different people saying something's happening, and they could go outside and look up. And so you're trying to get multiple witnesses from different areas looking at things. A lot of this was very effective, but he
I was
also
going to say,
traveled.
great idea that is.
Oh yeah, he traveled
Mm.
around the country doing a lot of things he's talked about. Went out to areas in New Mexico and across Arizona, and a lot of the films that he took. One thing I want to emphasize too, now that I'm thinking about it, is we're not talking about some guy that can, like a lot of YouTubers say, they can go out every day and look at the sky and get film or get video. Ray's got a number of films. Some of them even make my skin, the hair on my arm go up thinking about it, because some of them I've found things in them that he wasn't aware of. But when I saw it, it set me back. Not all films are what I call the wow factor. I've told him that those, I said, I can see what he's talking about in some of them, but it's nothing that's gonna really, it's like the Fleur video, which at the end of the day is just a fuzzy black spot doing some things.
Yeah.
We all can project what we've been told it is and try to see that in there, but at the end of the day, it's not really that impressive. You can't see anything. Some of Ray's films, you can see things in them. I mean, and these are films, so it's one of the hardest parts I've had with Ray is I wish he would get those films digitized. And I know he's got some equipment now that might allow him to do it. It's just, I'm afraid you get up in age, your technical savvy becomes an issue. But hopefully at the end of the day, at least the one I wrote about in my book is one that, because it has a huge backstory to it, it's not just, here's a film, look at this picture, there it is. This was a film that even Kevin Knuth was going to speak about in an SCU conference a couple of years ago. And someone heard about it. Unfortunately, I think it was my mistake. I never realized there was someone out there who would quickly try to go in and sabotage the whole thing. When I tried to let people know this was a chance to see some images from this film. First time Ray had put any of them out there. But somebody called and got Kevin's presentation nixed purely because of some of Ray's background interests and when he was doing some of his readings, or however you want to call them back then, which have nothing to do with the film. That's like claiming Einstein, because he had a specific kind of religious belief, should be discounted because of his mathematical abilities or theoretical.
Yeah, that's a silly scenario. Yeah, it is absurd.
The point is, that's not science. That's Correct. Not the way science operates. But needless to say, I stand by any number of the films Ray has gotten that I wish everybody would have a chance to see. I know a few people have been to see them. I know how put off, who was the guest speaker at this conference I was mentioning to you, had been to Ray's house and seen him and paid Ray $1,000 for showing him to him, which I'm thinking probably had to do with the Bigelow Bass studies. But anyway, then Ray got the film that I wrote about in the book, which I know the backstory on that one. And there's a lot more behind that one than just Ray's film. There was another scientist who went to see it and came up with some new concepts in aeromechanical drag reduction, or aerodynamics, I don't know what the term would be, that I had a little communication with as well. So I know he knows, but for some reason, nobody seems to, it's one of the thoughts that has occurred to me since 2017, especially when the Navy videos came out. There's so much emphasis on what's happening now. And now all of a sudden, could it be drones? Could it be this or that? I'm like, but there are some very substantial cases with evidence that happened before 2017. But you don't hear Congress saying, well, wait, let's take a look at some of these cases that were long before we had any of the technologies that that are popular out there today, and look for an explanation for those. I mean, you don't see that.
I agree. I don't know why they didn't go into the historical aspect of it properly. But, I suppose they have to start a point somewhere, but you shouldn't discount historical things. Now, with the film, is it a video, as in like an old film camera? So it was literally moving pictures.
I believe it's an 8mm. Some of his are 16, but okay. I think this was an 8mm camera. And actually, one of my, I would have thought, who carries around an 8mm camera? But once you get to know Ray, the first time I went to visit him, we were going to go eat, and we'd driven about a block away, and he suddenly stopped me and said, whoop, 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 I have to go back. I had to turn around, get his backpack with his camera in it. That's Ray. Back then, he carried that camera with him everywhere. And the story of how that film occurred was basically he and his wife had separated, and I think this was maybe his last chance to be with his son and his daughter at the time.
Oh, okay.
And they were down in Corpus Christi, and where he had taken them for a day out to an area along the pier of the ocean, an area called Emerald Bay Cove. You can actually still find this on Google Maps if you look at the aerial view. But apparently he and the children were out there walking along this pier, and there was another couple, I think, with their daughter there as well. So it wasn't just Ray. And it's interesting to me because he told me sometime afterwards, he said, he had always told his children, if either one of them ever sees something unique, like a UFO, whatever you want to call it, see something unusual, the first one to tell him, he'll pay him $10. So the kids were primed. And apparently it was the children who first saw this thing and pointed it out to him. And he said he almost dropped his slides out of his backpack trying to get his camera out fast enough. And he started filming a procession. It wasn't just one object. This was a series of, I believe, 7. I think the point was this last one was notably different. The first ones were these objects, and I had never heard of this before myself, but I've actually seen a sketch of something like this now. If you go back and look at some of the records of the Papua New Guinea 1959 case, a story of an object traveling on edge. In this particular case, the object that Ray saw, or this procession of at least 6 of these things, were objects that let's say you take a frisbee or a discus and you flip it up on its edge, and from the front surface of it, there's some kind of, it's difficult to see unless you can look at it in some of the frames. And when I first saw this, before I didn't see the film, to my knowledge, I don't know if anyone's actually seen the film playing, because I've gone over this with Ray and he keeps that thing so secure, locked away in a safe, doesn't want to damage it. But he showed this to me, and I think I was fortunate about 6 months after he took them that he had it on a slide screen. First time I'd been to his house to visit him, and he said, take a look at this. So you know the size of a slide screen is like 4 feet by 4 or 5 feet wide.
Okay.
And I could get up close. I mean, I got up to within 5 inches staring at this thing. And it was, I remember right then, if you've done any photography and you've seen, I was interested in astronomy. I said astronomical photography, astronomy. You can get a feeling from looking at an image and whether that's a real one or a fake one, especially these days. The more people work in Photoshop, which I do a lot, you kind of look for certain little things. But I was clear, and he had done some black and white images to enhance parts of this thing, that this was an object. And the first image I saw, because you remember they were coming in a procession, so he was filming them and they'd go straight overhead. So
were they going from behind him forward or from forward coming?
If I'm not mistaken, and I stand corrected on this if my recollection is, because they were coming, I don't recall whether they were coming from out more over the ocean going inwards over land, because he was on the coast down there at Corpus, or whether they were coming along the coastline and then moving outwards further out towards the Gulf. But the images, you know what, I'm almost want to say they had to be coming left or right, because the images that I saw were of the object moving away, left to right.
Okay.
But the point was, you can, in some of the images, you can see them more like you're looking at them face on, and other ones they're more side edge, and then other ones you're more from the back. So, and I think he said he ran and filmed the first 4 or 5 of them and ran out of film. But that's a substantial amount of film at 24 or whatever frames a second.
Yeah, a lot of frames, to
run it. But the last one was different, because he said it was shaped more like an hourglass and it was spinning. So, and the next to last of the objects I'm talking about, we refer to them as the beam ahead objects, because as they moved along, you could see some kind of a haze build up on the leading edge, and it would then compress into, on occasion, you could see what looked like a little structure. I used to think of it as almost like a windmill kind of a structure, but it would compress and fire out in a beam towards straight forward. I mean, a zoom, and it was pulsing, because at times you could see it differentiating. But I recall specifically one of the images, the surface of the object was much more clouded, because I'm assuming whatever this was, maybe it was a plasma of some type building up. And as it compressed and fired outwards along this beam, you could see the surface a little more clearly. And as some of the pictures Ray's had since then that he's enhanced, you can see some odd patterns on them, but they were almost like little tiny red emitters. I mean, this has been long years, and I did the best I could to illustrate it in my book. I want to make one point too, just not to hedge, but people have asked me, well, why didn't you put actual pictures in your book? Ray and I have kind of an interesting friendship. We've been friends since middle of the 80s. But he is extremely cautious with his material, doesn't want it to get out. That's probably one of the reasons he is not. I've told him we're getting older. Why wait any longer? But he'll invite people to his home to look at this material. But I didn't want to get into any kind of contention over whether he agreed with what I was writing in my book or not. Fortunately, after it was done and he read it, he was pleased with it. Since then, I've told him, I said, if I ever do a second printing of it, I'd love to get some actual photos.
Hell yeah, we want to see those.
But what I illustrated in there gives the best I could to represent what I recall having seen and what I've seen since then. I mean, I've got images he sent me since then. Kevin Knuth has seen them as well. And if you go online and actually look up Kevin Knuth's, presentation, I believe one or two of the original images that Ray, I may be able to provide this to you,
Yeah, if you
out there
can, that'd be great.
will show what I'm kind of talking about. Now, this is an object that's more about shaped like a discus, a little, not just flat on one side, but a discus. But there's a dome shape on the trailing side, I guess what I'll call the backside. The beam seems to be firing out of the center of what you might say is the underside of the Frisbee, but it's traveling along on edge. And each of the objects were traveling along on edge like that. Curious thing is there's a point where one of them, as it's moving away, some kind of, I don't know if you've heard in the discussion about this phenomenon, people talk about a slow beam, where some kind of a beam seems to project out, but it seems to come out slowly.
I haven't heard
There's
this
one,
before, no.
it's, don't ask me to explain it. I'm just telling you what I've heard and what I've seen. And one of these images, though, Ray has of this, by now it's a blob because it's moving away into the sky. But you see an odd looking, and it's not perfectly perpendicular to the object, odd looking pattern of some sort of beam that extends outwards. And not sure, we've speculated on what that might be about. But the point is, the few frames that have actually he has made still shots of and enhanced those frames, I'm like, imagine what's in the other frames that you can't even see, what you would be able to see if you could see this thing moving. And I'm still trusting one way or the other that one of these days this film will be analyzed. But the reason I put it in the book, and this is something that I want people to understand, along with the film of Paul Benowitz, was because of the connection between the two films to the Air Force Research Lab. I mean, I'm not sure if I didn't emphasize that as well as I should have in the book, but that's why I wrote about these two films. They weren't just two random films. And ultimately, both of them seem to have gained some tie to people at the Air Force or with connections to the Air Force research labs, even though with Paul Benowitz, it was called the Air Force Weapons Lab at the time, but it was at Kirtland Air Force Base. But the idea of that was an interesting connection to me, especially with Ray's film, that ultimately the man, a scientist from Rensselaer who had been to see Ray's film, in fact, he was taken to see Ray's film by the guy who was the first person to have seen it. I mean, I was maybe fortunately to be the second a few months later, but there was a young man that Ray knew who had seen these images beforehand and ended up going to school up at Rensselaer and taking a course in aeromechanical engineering or whatnot, and happened to tell one of his professors, if you saw what Ray had on film, you'll be way ahead of where you are now. And later on, they were attending a conference in Washington, just where Ray lives near Washington now. And they came over to visit Ray. This is all, Ray's got materials that can substantiate all of this as well. And I've written to this man, spoke with him on the phone shortly about the fact that it was sometime afterward. I think it was around 1993, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of people weren't even really on the internet yet. There were no Facebook, none of this stuff back then. You joined groups, and come home and you'd read the list of what was written. And at one point, and by the way, this is all outlined in the book. If you've seen, if you have not seen the book, I'll send you a copy.
I have not seen
PDF.
it.
Well, I will get it to you. I mean,
thank you.
And in fact, people, just to clarify, the reason I didn't get it in print, not that I wouldn't like to, and nowadays I don't know that it may be a moot point, was because at least with a digital PDF book, I can get the images as sharp and as clear, and you can zoom in a little bit, and the contrast is much better than it printed on a book with, it would have cost a substantial amount for each book if I wanted it on glossy pages like an art book. But anyway, needless to say, one night I came home from work and happened to open up, I think it was a discussion group way back then, and I think this was early 92, 93. There was a group called the Skunk Works Digest, which was actually like a Facebook group now, but it was people who were interested in new aircraft technologies coming out of Lockheed Skunk Works and whatnot. But someone had posted a mention on there of a new concept that had been discovered, and it showed an image. And the image, I recreated it in my book, was in a hypershock wind tunnel through the little viewport of what appeared to be a discus on edge with a welder spike sticking out the center, pointing forward. And what they'd shown was when they released the shock wind, it's like a wind tunnel, but it's a hypershock speed. So that shock wave coming down when they fire that spark on the end of the welder's arc, you could see the airwaves divert and go around the outside edge of the object. So it was a concept in reducing drag.
Yeah.
By, and the point was, if you can project energy out front that can cause the disruption of the airflow,
yes,
so that
sense.
It spreads out, you end up with a low density bubble, a tunnel around your vehicle. And when I saw the picture, I was like, holy cow. I called Ray up and I said, Ray, you're not going to believe this. Somebody has proven this point of this, what we had, by this time, we'd been talking a while and kind of come up with what could this energy pulse be doing. And in fact, you can make out in the images on the film a point out front where there begins a splay pattern, just what you would expect as the atmosphere is spreading outwards.
Yeah.
But when I told him, I said, I cannot pronounce this gentleman's name. It's Lake Mir. He said, oh, that's Lake Marabo. He was here at my house a few years ago looking at my films. I'm like, well, get a load of this. And so I sent him the link, right? And I had my own little website years ago when I worked at the University of North Texas for the Texas Center for Educational Technology. I made my own little website called UFOs: A Closer Look. And I was real quick. You can actually still find it if you go back to archive.org. You can find the page that I had created. And I wrote an article, and I was going to lay this out, that this scientist who'd been to see Ray's film and had gone back, and actually Ray's got plenty of communication with this gentleman as well, and some pamphlets and articles he's been sent since then. Keep in mind, the first guy that ever saw the film, who was a student up there, accompanied Marabo over to Ray's house. So there's another witness that was there as well. But I wrote an article in which I was going to say what I had to say about Ray's film and then point out how this gentleman had been to see it. And then it occurred to me, I don't want to jinx something, and I haven't really discussed anything with this man. I don't know what his thoughts are on it. And I decided, I talked to Ray and I said, I don't know that it's the smartest move to come out right now and just blast this out there, because I'm not seeking publicity for myself. And if this scientist is eventually in a position where he can come out and acknowledge that he'd been to see Ray's film, and these ideas were spawned from having seen these objects that he'd never seen, and he came up with this concept called the directed energy air spike. To me, that's a telltale thing right there, directed energy, because even though he had go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say on that, if he's got this invention, if we'll call it that, is it like patented at a certain date where you could prove it's the chicken and the egg, but the egg definitely came after the chicken, that sort of thing?
Well, yeah. One of the things that I did, and I spent a lot of time trying to do it in the book, was to ensure, because keep in mind, the idea of finding a way to divert the atmosphere ahead of your craft, that's not new. I mean, there were missiles and such that had actual physical spikes out front, solely intended to break the airwaves up as it went, as they go by, to avoid burning up the nose cone with the heat of reentry. The idea of doing that is not necessarily a new thing. But I went back and looked at, for example, when this gentleman published his paper, he and three other people had, went together and published papers on this. Go and look at their footnotes, see what they cite, and go as far back as you can to see what prior work they cited. And you'll realize there's a point after his where there is a huge amount of fascinating work that's been developed on using microwave energies and other forms of energy to try to mitigate the shock waves out in front. But you see it taper off prior to his work. There wasn't a whole lot of much of anything that had been done. And when you look at the image of what he did, first off, if you're most people, I would think, if you're going to try to mitigate shock waves and you're going to use a model inside a shock tunnel, you're going to use what? A plane, an aircraft, a car?
Yes, something obvious.
Yeah, you're not going to take a disc-shaped discus and stand it on edge.
Certainly not on its edge,
The point is, that was what got me. I read the whole article once I saw the image, because I was like, whoa, that in itself is so highly unique. And then it ties in with this gentleman specifically who had been to visit Ray. And you look at what he came up with and the purpose behind it, which was exactly what we had looked at Ray's film, and just the two of us looking at it, you begin to decide they're not going to waste that much energy firing a beam out front unless it serves a purpose. And once Ray's managed to enhance some of those images, and I think Kevin Knuth used one of these in his presentation that he was going to give, you begin to see the actual bow waves or whatever you want to call them out front, where this beam seems to be, my theory was you project enough energy and it creates kind of an outward blast effect. Like if you fire a lightning bolt in a straight line, and as it blasts the atmosphere out, you're creating a low density tunnel. There was actually a scientist in Arizona, and I think I mentioned him in the book as well, who I came across some of his designs, and he had a patent on this kind of thing, exactly what we're talking about. And I spoke to him, and he's like, boy, it's depressing to think he's had a patent on something that I had already seen. And I wasn't making the point that anybody had ever patented any of this kind of thing. But the idea is what Ray got on film is a series of several objects moving along and another one trailing along behind them. And he even said it was interesting that the last object of the first 4 or 5 slowed down to let the final object catch up to it before they both finally moved away. What that suggests to me is this beam firing out front may have been getting the atmosphere out of the way.
Yes.
But it wasn't all that was holding the vehicle up. If it can slow down in the air then and not fall out of the sky, then it's being held up by some kind of other aerodynamical means or power mechanism, whatever.
Well, it's a double process then, isn't it? It's a process of moving the air to move through. It's an interesting one then, because then that sparks thoughts of every UFO that we've seen, in theory, has this ability to get the air out of the way somehow. And is that why there's no shockwaves associated with UFOs, like sound, sonic boom, should we say?
Could be. I mean, these days we have so many wide out there theories of people coming up with different kind of ideas, and I guess that's where ideas come from, right? Somebody's got to think of it.
Yeah.
But at the time, I had never heard or seen talk of an object actually, I'll use the word loosely, flying, moving on edge, because the flat surface is so contrary to what we think of as aerodynamics. But I've been interested in the Papua New Guinea case, the Fothergill case, which you can find plenty of information on that. And years ago, one night on eBay, somebody was auctioning off a huge document that had been written, I believe it was by Norman Crutwell. He was the other priest who was there in New Guinea at the time, and he actually did a whole long report on this. And I managed to get a copy of that report. And in some of the sketches that had been the witnesses that Crutwell had spoken to had described seeing objects, and some of them were the typical flying saucer on edge. But one of them shows this object flipped up on its side with a dome on one side. And there you go. I mean, all I can say is somebody way back in 1959 must have been seeing something like this. So maybe they can all do that. I don't know.
Well, yeah, it brings you to, I don't know whether it's called the gimbal one or whatever, that black blob that does move in that fashion as well, isn't it?
Yeah,
there's when it moves on its side.
Ray's been curious about that one too, because there are times in its configuration that it does have a semblance to some of what Ray was having. But to me, I'm like, that's not a conclusion I'm going to draw just yet.
No, it's not crisp. Can I just go back to the Ray film? When you said it was projected, I don't know, 4 foot by 4 foot or whatever, how big was the object against that 4 foot 4 by 4 canvas?
This is a tough one to try to remember because I'm trying to visualize myself in Ray's living room looking at the screen, but it did not fill the screen up. I mean, it wasn't the side of a old 78 LP or anything, whatever it was. I mean, this was, I'd say, the size of a silver dollar maybe, or something where you had to get up close enough to look. I wanted to see if I could spot any kind of detail or whatever. And that's when I recall what I believe I tried to recreate in the book was when the beam would fire out and the surface was clearer, let's just say, less clouded. I vaguely recall seeing small little red, what all I would call them is like emitters around the surface of this thing. Now, Ray's done some enhancement of the images of the thing more from the side where you get some odd panel configurations on it. But to me, the whole point is, there are people at NASA and elsewhere who are far better than I would ever be with Photoshop or any of the software even we have today.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it?
I would want people like that, some of the experts in film recreation and enhancement and whatnot to get their hands on this and look at it. And I'm like, if you show this thing to those people in Congress, explain how any of us have this back in 1985, especially when an expert in aeromechanical engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic University goes to see what Ray's got, and it stimulates his idea for a new concept in aeromechanical drag reduction. That there was an article that was written because NASA had a breakthrough propulsion physics program going on for a while. And I remember the gentleman who was, I guess, the curator of this program, if that's the right term, wrote a summary or an article about this concept in which Mirabeau was trying to decide, well, the amount of energy that it's going to take to create this beam firing out front, where are you going to get that energy? And the idea was, could you beam energy to your vehicle from a ground-based location or from a space-based location?
Nice.
That would then it would obviate the need for it to have onboard, some mechanisms on board. And the guy that was writing for the NASA Breakthrough Propulsion Physics program made exactly that point. He says it's a great idea, but we don't even have the infrastructure yet to make it work. So who built what Ray filmed back in 1986? You see, that's one of the things
nobody.
I would like to see people ask. Yeah, nobody around here that I know of, for sure.
Earlier when you said about X amount of objects moving along, it reminded me of the Kenneth Arnold thing when he saw, the similar sort of amount traveling in that group.
Yep.
I'm not saying it's the same thing because I don't think they were on edge. They were traveling, sort of wobbling along, weren't they? But it does certainly remind me of that. So it was in color, this video.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, this film, should I say?
This film, yes.
And so the snapshots that Ray showed you presumably were the ones that weren't blurry, because obviously at that stage there's got to be some give in the camera.
Oh, I imagine there is.
I imagine there is, yeah.
Yeah, well, I told Ray, I said, but with the technology these days where you can image stabilization and whatnot,
yeah.
Wouldn't you love to see that? Oh, yeah. And I mean,
hell yeah, and drop AI in there to interpolate between scenes.
Yeah, there are things that's what I told Ray. There are things that you can do as sitting at home now that used to have a studio to do. And
yes,
a lot of this kind of stuff, you mentioned graphics cards, well, I've done some 3D animation in Maya for stuff I've worked on. And you're right, the graphics card a lot of times covers a lot of that stuff with GPU processes. It's just frustrating because I can understand Ray has taken a lot of what I'll call heat over not the films and not his. It's just he is very cautious because, especially with the background he's had, which not a lot of people understood, maybe a lot of people still don't to this day, involving with his intuitive, I guess you would call them psychic readings or whatnot. I was not there at the time. I know friends of his that I've met. They've stuck with him all these years. And the entire time I've known him, that's never been an issue. He's never even brought it up because, to my understanding, he left that way back then when he got serious into the UFO side of things and more into the science aspects and technologies and whatnot. But people have refused to look at Ray's material because, specifically, one person who he who shall not be named, who has seemingly made it his effort to ennoble himself by diminishing Ray or trying to keep people from looking at Ray's information to the point of getting this SCU to stop Kevin Knuth's presentation because they hadn't vetted it. I'm like, wait, this is Kevin Knuth. He's got a great reputation. He knows what he saw. I mean, nobody's expecting any of us to be perfect with everything, but as science, you'd want to see it anyway. I mean, I guarantee you,
of course, you
want to see it. I want to see it.
I do, 100%. You should never. I mean, obviously, in science, as with anything, you record everything, and then the extreme outliers, obviously, they don't form part of the overall pattern that you're seeing. But you still need to see that data, because it may be pertinent to the pattern.
Right. The whole point of peer reviewing it is because one person out there may see something nobody else did, and then you get closer to the truth. You don't just decide, I don't like the way somebody wears their shirt or their outfit, and so I don't want to hear anything he says. That goes back to the whole belief thing that we were talking about earlier. And it's a shame. It's a shame because, and this is not the only, in fact, this is a profound film Ray has. To me, because of the backstory of Lake Mirabeau, that he saw it. And I know other people, like I said, Hal Puthoff has seen it. Other people have been there to see it. The problem is getting that film digitized.
Well,
That's
it throws open
frustrating.
the question to me, and I imagine everyone who's listening and or watching this are going to say is, why is it not out there? Now, there's two parts to this next bit, which I'm going to say is, I know there are lots of pieces of evidence down the years in relation to the UFO subjects where people have handed over documents, pieces that they say they might have from a craft or whatever, and then it's never seen again. So I get that side of things from Ray. He's cautious; he doesn't want to lose it.
Well,
But
he does not want to be out of the room when somebody is digital.
yes,
Actually,
tampering.
I found one of the most high quality studios that could actually digitize that. They do work for the National Archives for the US government, not far from Ray. The problem though is, in a company, you need to drop it off. And Ray is like, he wants to be able to be there in the room. That would take a lot of organization, and then how to Ray getting there. And like I said, unfortunately, we're not kids. He's older than I am, and I think
Mm.
his memory is not as sharp as it was. But someone who, for what it's worth, I won't mention his name, but a couple of gentlemen that you might know the names, had been to see Ray recently, saw a lot of his material. One of them actually bought a film digitizer for Ray, and I
Yes.
was I was like, hallelujah. But Ray's not the most technically savvy person to this day, and it's still a matter of, his wife is smart as a whip. She worked for Goddard for years and years and years, and I'm like, she and he could get together and do it. It's just, I don't know. I can't explain it. I'm not
It
telling you it's
doesn't make
not
sense, does
frustrating.
it? It doesn't make
Well,
sense because if you're the governor or arbiter of some measure of something that could really enhance humanity, why would you not get out there? Even if it ends up being debunked, right? I'm not saying it is. I believe, there's that
everything's
word
going
again.
to be, somebody
Yeah,
is going to
it
be.
needs to come out there.
I
So,
agree. And I talk to Ray almost not every day now, but he had a bad accident the other day and was in the
oh,
hospital for a while. And I was worried something was going to happen to him. But I'm like, man, if I had the money, I'd fly out there and help him digitize that thing. I don't have any doubts about, of course, I think he's also a little concerned, which maybe is a valid concern nowadays, that is the film been, is it still intact and good enough? I know he keeps it
mm,
locked up in his safe. And in fact, Lake Mirabeau, the gentleman who went to see it, that told me when I talked to him on the phone, he recalled, he said, yeah, I know he keeps that locked up in his safe, which to me meant I knew he had visited Ray, because how would you know that if you hadn't been there to
exactly.
visit? But still, I don't want anybody to think that I don't see your point exactly. I have
Mm.
fought this out, figuratively speaking, with Ray for years and years, because it's like artwork. I told Ray, I said, look, any piece of art, it's got to be seen to be sold. Not everybody's going to buy it, but nobody's going to even know it exists if they don't see it.
Yeah.
You know?
And not only that, time degrades film as well, anyway, doesn't it? And
Oh
time
yeah,
degrades the human. So we're on a time frame here. I really hope it comes out. I 100% do. So
I
well
do
played
too.
to you and all the others who are not pushing but encouraging Ray to make that leap because it needs to happen. Really.
I will say, in favor of some of Ray's films, there are more than just that one. There is another one that he had sent me of, for lack of a better term to call it, I'm just going to say maybe some mothership or something, but it was a long
Mm.
cloud covered object that somewhere out east of where he lives that he got film of. And he had sent me several, still frames of this thing. And I don't know if you recall, laptops from years ago had these unusual TFT screens or whatever, that if you didn't
Hmm.
look at them straight on,
Yeah, they were
the
polarized a bit,
coloration would
weren't they?
go.
Yeah.
And one time he sent me an image from this thing that was different from a frame that was different from the others. And I happened to lean back with my old laptop, an old Toshiba laptop on. And when I leaned back, it skewed the colors of it. And for just a moment, I saw something that, whoa, well, now I kind of have something I'm aiming for. I put it into Photoshop, really played with the contrast and light and exposure, and you get an image that there's something narrow down inside this cloudy shape thing that seems to be rolling off. And there's several, I mean, this is what makes my hand go up on hairs go up on my arm. There are several bright points, like 4 bright points equidistant along the edge of this thing. And that's what I saw. If you've looked at the old Christmas cards where you have the stars and they have the diffraction pattern around them with the kind of the cross shape in, you get that. And I'm like, I actually saw it's faint, it's not
But it's
hard to
there.
see. Once you see it's there. And Ray had not looked specifically at that frame, and all the other frames, the cloudiness is thick enough that you can't really make out what's inside there. But I did some comparison to overlap 2 frames to see if the cloud patterns changed. And I mean, Ray knows me for the guy that, like, let me take a look at it before you tell me anything, because I'm just going to see what I can see before anything else. He's got another one that shows, it's a film that he took out an airplane flying back from Mexico to the US. And this one has been written up or has been talked about in some papers by a famous scientist from over in Europe, because it shows diffraction patterns. Strange, some object goes in front of this longer one behind it, and at a point along the way, suddenly you get this ring pattern that strikes out as this thing's going along. He calls it the Tizayuka film. That's another one. This one that you will remember the most is a picture, if you ever remember the Day the Earth Stood Still had the big shiny metal called Gort.
Yeah.
Well, that's just a name that we plugged onto this one image, the Gort image. And he wasn't filming this image. He wasn't filming looking at what this craft or this object was. It was something else in the background that he was filming in the distance. And in 1 frame, suddenly there's a pop-up. You can't miss it. I mean, once you look at that frame, it's obvious there's a shape of something right there in the corner of this frame. And when you blow it up and look at it, you can't miss it. I showed it to a woman who was a friend of mine years ago. I just put it up on that laptop I was telling you about, let her take a look at it. And in about 2 seconds, she's like, whoa, because there is a correlated image that Ray's notorious for this, going way back and looking through old magazine articles and old photos from magazines going back years before. And suddenly you'll find an image that matches exactly what in this particular case, it was, I think in France, a little girl who was out in the yard and saw an object slowly descending with a figure in it. And she apparently ran inside and got her mom. When they came back out, it was moving away. But when she drew a picture of it, this picture Ray got, which it's almost like best I could tell is I began to think, this thing has to come in, maybe pause for an 1/18 of a second, or few tenths of a second to be caught like a ghostly image on this film, and then moved out of the way. And you can kind of get a feel for some of that. But it's an object that looks like it's got a platter or a ledge, a ring ledge around this something. I'm guessing it'd be about the size of, if you took an average car and stood it up on end, because the upper shape is clearly a dome. You can see the light reflecting on the sides of the figure inside, as well as this, what looks like some kind of glass dome or something. The bottom is kind of a cone shape that comes down, maybe cut off flat on the bottom, like a old style ice cream cone.
Yeah, I know the one you mean.
But it's got that flat rim around it with a clear shape, and inside is a figure that looks like one arm's down, and there may be some kind of none of this is crystal clear. I'm just saying, after you looked at it all these years, you begin to think, what am I seeing? But you can definitely see this figure, something, we call it Gort because you can't make out a face or anything. It looks more like a huge figure standing there with one arm down and maybe some kind of a small something in front of him, standing inside, seen from here up, inside this glass dome. And I'd swear, if I send you, maybe I will, send you the picture of what the little girl drew from France, there would be virtually no doubt this is a child sketch of exactly what this thing was. There's no accounting for why it's there. That's not what he was filming. It just suddenly appeared in one.
It's just there. Now that's blowing your mind, isn't it?
Yeah, to think, how could something get in and out?
It's freaky, but I like it.
And everybody that's been to see Ray and Ray has asked, guess what picture impressed them the most? I just say Gort.
That one. Yeah.
That's the one that'll get you every time.
These have to get out, man. Everyone needs to see this, don't they? It needs thorough investigation and rigorous testing to bring up the contrast or do whatever to make it as crystal clear as we can. We need to do this.
I want the films digitized. I want to see when Gort comes in and when he leaves.
Yeah, we need to definitely have that, because we can't afford to lose it, because it will degrade and go. Another couple of things it reminded me of that. Have you ever watched the Skinwalker Ranch program? Curse of Skinwalker Ranch?
I
Did
am
you ever
not
see
a
it?
habitual skinwalker. I've seen a few episodes of it. It, for whatever reason, maybe I'm the one person in the crowd. I've not seen anything that really has impressed me. It seems like, but I realize their job is to make a TV show to sell
Of
advertising.
course, of course.
It's not a
But the
documentary.
reason I mentioned it is because in that they've in the later series, not the first few series, you all have seen all of a sudden in one frame of their video filming, you will see a craft. It's literally just in one frame, and then off it goes. Presumably it goes, or it either blinks in and blinks out. That's reminded me of that. It's got to be moving so fast, but there it is. There it is. I wonder if
Yeah,
we set up cameras everywhere running on really, really I don't know whether it's fast or slow shutter, whatever
60
you want to
frames a
call it.
second. Yeah.
Yeah. That would we catch these things everywhere? It's an interesting thought.
And that's to me is the quintessential question. You won't know till you can't find out until you do it.
Mm,
But what I have seen in Ray's film, and especially this one, tells me that for however it's happening, these things are able to move so quickly that it's like a person who's filming and a bug goes in front of them. They don't see it
mm,
until you watch the film later on. Then you see some dark little tiny thing go in front of them. You're not aware that it's there, so you're not looking
correct.
for it. You're not going to pay attention to it anyway. But I wouldn't be at all surprised because this object that I was just describing has the figure in it. I was curious how fast or how short of amount of time might it have needed to be there to achieve that kind of a almost slightly transparent effect. So I got a sky background in Photoshop and I got the original, I made a solid outline of an image of this thing, layered them over, and then adjust the opacity until it gets down to where it matches. And it was like 24% opacity. But I'm thinking, okay, in one frame of film, how fast would you need to be in and out to be transparent in that one frame
In
of
one
film?
frame, yeah.
And I say in and out, if it was approaching, it may have been coming in and growing larger, and he just happened to get the film at that moment. But and I stand to be corrected on this. In other words, if some scientist gets involved and says what I thought I was, the point I'm getting at is there are some odd striation patterns around it that make me think, did it move in this way and move out that way? Because you get a slight little blur effect this way and that way, which
It's got two
made me
tails.
wonder.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, we've all done the old time lapse photos, a 1 second exposure where you move your hand in and back out, and you just get the slight blur. But in that instant where it changes direction and it has to slow down, then you see the shape of the hand.
That's right.
That's the impression that I got from this image, that whatever it was, if it had kept moving, and obviously Ray did not see it visually. I don't think anybody that was there saw it visually. But as long as it's moving fast enough and not sitting in front of your face long enough that the camera caught it, so I don't know, maybe some scientists can come up with some better theories for how that could happen. But
Yeah, but we can't really properly do that until we get these films digitized. So it's all hinging on that. So come on, Ray, if you ever see this, I know you've been asked many times. Please do it. Please do it. Hey ho, let's move on from the Ray stuff. And I'm going to move into the disinformation arena and the Benowitz case. Now, I've heard a lot of the Benowitz case over the years, leading to all sorts of things like the Dulce base and all this scenario. But should we start with who Paul Benowitz was and what's his story and what did he do that started off the scenario?
Paul Benowitz lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He lived in an area that's just on the east side of Albuquerque called the Four Hills. And it's kind of a upscale, I guess you call it gated community. It's like an entire block that's surrounded by a wall, but very nice location right on the very northern edge of the Kirtland Air Force Base Sandia Reservation area. And from his house, which was a 2-story house, but you go out on the back deck and you can actually get up on the roof. And from the roof of his house, you can see over everything, over the fence line, straight into the whole Sandia area because it slopes upwards. So you pretty much have a clear view to the very end of these low hills called the Manzanos, and it's about 3 miles to the end of it. And from his rooftop, you could almost look straight down to the airport and whatever, but he had a really kind of a bird's eye view with the whole 360 degrees if you wanted to
Yeah.
turn all around. And somewhere along the way, let's back up to, let's say, the beginning of 1979. His films that he got were in 1980. But back in those days, in the mid 70s and whatnot, cattle mutilations was a big topic in the northern New Mexico, southern Colorado area. And around the Archuleta Mesa, Dulce, the name Dulce is a small town up there,
Mm-hmm.
in the Archuleta Mesa, there were lots of reports of cattle mutilation things going on. There was a police officer, Gabe Valdez, who became very, very well known as because he kind of oversaw, I guess the way I'll put it. He policed some of the Indian reservation area as well. And at some point, there was a big conference that was put together by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and these all met, I think, in the early months of 1979, and a lot of people attended who were interested in the cattle mutilation situation at the time. And somehow or other, Paul, who I think had already been in touch with APRO, so he had obviously developed some interest of his own, because his name appears on a list of some of the people who had attended this meeting as kind of an APRO representative. At that meeting, to my understanding, is where he met or heard about Gabe Valdez, the police officer who patrolled some of this area around Dulce and the Archuleta Mesa and whatnot. And so I believe it was around June or July of 1979, after he'd gone up to that meeting, he arranged to drive up to the Dulce area and kind of do a ride along with Gabe Valdez.
Okay.
And he took his camera and he went up there. And apparently, a lot of this is from material Paul had sent me. He sent me some written material typed out with notes on it. He was working on a book of his own, I think, at the time. And it described this whole experience as well as how he ended up getting the films that he's famous for. But on that ride along, he said they saw some unusual lights that he couldn't account for. And so the next day before he left, or whenever before he left, next day, he took a photograph of an area that had a tall pine tree and showing the mountains, kind of, I guess, just to take it was a Polaroid, comes out to show where he'd been. And when he gets back to Albuquerque, my understanding is his wife looked at it, and and you can clearly see it. He sent me, this is another one of those things that's hard to imagine, a box full of mounted 8x10s, and including this Polaroid. And on the Polaroid, by one of the large pine trees or whatever it was, there's an unusual something in the air about it. It's small, obviously, but you blow it up and you can get a sense of some kind of shape. No telling what it was. I don't need that Paul ever worried about what it was, but the fact that the thing was there in this photograph, we all speculate on how could it suddenly be there? What are the odds? And he began to wonder, is something out there, something going around in that area that's keeping track of who's poking around? But needless to say, it sparked his interest in what was there.
Sure.
So over the next 6 months or so, he made 2 or 3 more trips up there. One of them specifically with his son, because he writes about, well, they're out there at night filming some unusual things going on. And he laughs about his son filming, fooling with a camera, trying to get the camera ready to take films. But there was no doubt there was something that they had seen out there at night, that Paul saw one object, and I'm running on memory here, that seemed to be a light that they saw seemed to be moving slowly along the borders of some of the cliffs of the mountains at the Archuleta area. And he went up there one last time. I don't know what he was thinking by then, but he wrote in here he wanted to get up there and back before winter. So I'm guessing, the best I could figure, it was probably in November of 1979 or so. One last time he went up there, because even he had begun to wonder if there was some degree of, he didn't quite know what, communication or something. If they were there, could he set up his camera, kind of like what you mentioned? Could you just set up the camera and see if you get something? And he had a camera set up. He counted to 3, took an image, and one of those images is the very famous one that looks like some streaking color, multicolored object. I reproduced this in the book too, along with the canyon behind it, I believe, and whatnot. You can make out a little shape to it, but I'm not going to say specifically what I can. There were 2 or 3 images that he got that had that same weird, almost like, I don't know how to describe it. It's kind of a rainbow streak pattern with some, as though
A
something
lensing
streaking.
effect sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not lens flare. It's not. I mean, I know what lens flares look like. In general, you've got to have a light source that's going to, But needless to say, I don't know. The point was, all it did was it sparked his interest enough to be very
Sure.
peculiar. But what really got things going is when he gets back to Albuquerque, his wife described an odd thing that had occurred late at night when they're like 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, something like this. The dog starts barking and woke her up. And she heard a really loud humming kind of noise, like a piece of chainsaw equipment or something that she said sounded like it was coming from above the house. Well, in Paul's mind, considering he's now been primed to wonder what's going on, he began to wonder, is it possible that whatever he's been poking around, up there in New Mexico somehow has took notice of him and maybe followed him back and knows where he lives in Albuquerque? I admit it, it's out there. That's definitely, it's a stretch. But the bottom line is that got him up on the roof of his house. So now we're talking late December. He made two descriptions, or two things that he wrote. One was that it was close down to, I think it was like 19 degrees one night, and there was no moon out. So I just checked an almanac to see when in 1979 was there a new moon, no moon, and did the temperature get that low? And the best I could locate was somewhere around the middle of December, 15th, 16th, somewhere in that range. But so he's up on the roof of his house. You got to imagine freezing his tail off. And it's funny to think about it now, because the only person I've ever heard of before who was out on the ground freezing their tail off was some of what Ray described when he and his people would spend time out there at their site in Austin, out there on the ground in the freezing weather. But Paul's up there, and at one point, and I'm getting the impression I get is this is late in the evening. It's not 7 o'clock. This is like midnight, 1 o'clock, when he's staying out there for a long time. And at one point, I tried to do the best I could to recreate this in the book to see what the image might be from, because I drove out to Albuquerque several times and tried to take a lot of photographs to see where you could actually see from the roof of the top of his house and what it would look like. The point is, you're not just down at the fence level and the ground is rising and you don't see anything. You're now looking almost eye level, almost across towards the base of these Manzano hills. But he suddenly sees something glow and brighten that he said it appeared to either be near the ground or on the ground. But he started watching, and then a few minutes later, it would glow up and bright again. And not long after it had done that a couple of times, suddenly there was a very bright burst, boom. And then a few seconds later, boom, somebody shot up. The thing lifts up off the ground to 300 or 400 feet, it shoots off south and gone around the corner at the bottom of the mountain. Whoa.
Yeah, definitely a whoa.
Now I imagine he's up there every night. And at one night, he gets his wife out there with him, because he's talking to her, looking at these things. Somehow they're getting in there when he doesn't notice it, and he finds them on the ground. One time he saw one come in, I think. But even his wife wondered, when they're seeing the lights of the security guards moving along inside this highly secure, double perimeter electrified fence, because there's nuclear materials and whatnot buried in the Manzano Mountains, at least they were. They see the guard lights, what look like truck lights that they think are the guards, security guards, going along, and they think, how can the guards not see these things? Except that if they're dark most of the time until they brighten up. But he told his wife finally, said, when he finally saw that bright burst suddenly, boom, he told his wife, get ready, here they go. And sure enough, boom. At this point, he's seeing 4 objects. One of them, a large one, twice the size of the smaller ones. And he drew all these sketches of what he was seeing and the glows around them. And you can make out, if you look in the book, there was an unusual kind of a spot that appeared to, as though it rotates as the object rotates. But when it takes off from the ground, there's an odd looking spark shape, like a little discharge. I don't know what it is, as the thing takes, or maybe it's just when it makes a lateral movement. But the objects, all 4 of them rise up, and he got filmed. By this time, he's got his camera out there. He's got a Hasselblad still camera. He's got another camera mounted on a telescope, and he's got a some little 8mm film camera. Didn't know what type it was. but he films these things, and he sent me pictures, not only of his little reel-to-reel editor showing the film with the images in there, but images that he took of the objects on the film. They're not the best there are. I mean, I can do some things in Photoshop to kind of enhance the objects and take out the background colors. But you can see enough to realize there's some sort of vehicles in there. And especially when they're on the ground, one of the images, you can actually see the bright lights going around the rim of one of these objects sitting on the ground. What he filmed, of course, my understanding is the same film still had the last trip that he had taken up to New Mexico on it. So it was a few weeks later before he got the whole thing developed. But the best I was able to find is it's by the end of January, somewhere in 1980, that he calls down on the base. And he called the base because he thought he was doing the right thing. Because he had told me, he said he never heard any alarms or saw no activity going on out there on the base. And this is inside the double perimeter fence. It's not just on the outside, which is basically the Sandia or Kirtland grounds. This area had an electrified fence to keep anybody from going in there. And and Major Edwards, who I spoke with eventually and met him once in Albuquerque, he was in charge of the guards inside the facility. So when Paul called down there, first person he got in contact with was Major Edwards. And he wanted to talk to him about the objects that he had seen coming and going on the ground. Edwards, as far as I know, was not aware of it. And so he put Paul in touch with the Base Investigative Service, AFOSI,
okay,
who happened to be Richard Doty. So that's the person who ultimately first, I think, may have been the first person to go up and actually meet Paul Benowitz at his office. But it's always been odd to me because you don't have any documentation out of AFOSI or Kirtland for that 6-month period from January until April or June, when Paul kind of began to go off the reservation. He began to contact other people about this. You don't really have any documentation of what Doty wrote or who he wrote about it. I've spoken to Doty once or twice. I'm not a fan of his, needless to say.
Sure, yeah, I understand.
But the best, well, Paul got something on film. He tried to let people know what he got. And there's no denying that he got it. I mean, his wife saw it. People have seen the films that he's got. You look at the films, you got something for sure. And the Air Force reaction, it's odd to me because I would have expected them to just say, call MUFON. We're not interested in UFOs anymore, call whoever. But they didn't. Doty kept in communication with Paul, and even when Bill Moore got involved after he had joined APRO, then Doty's feeding Bill Moore information to try to get that to Paul. And then in November, they get Paul to come down to a meeting on the base with the Brigadier General William Brookshire. Why would you want to have a UFO guy who's taken films of UFOs, invite him down to the base? That in itself would start. I mean, I would think that would be a PR disaster if that got out.
Yeah, it strikes me as odd.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts on that? Why did you think they did it?
The one thing that Paul mentioned that happened from that was, because like I said early on a while ago, the reason I wrote about these two films is because of the connection to the Air Force Research Lab. Even though at the time in Kirtland in the 80s, early 80s, it was the Air Force Weapons Lab. Eventually, they all got kind of combined under the Air Force Research Lab moniker. And it's interesting because now Kirtland is the home of the Space Vehicles Directorate. I thought, well, that's a coincidence. But one of the things that allegedly, or at least Paul reported, happened after the meeting was he was approached by a gentleman, I can't recall the name right now, who suggested, Paul, why don't you put in for a grant, a grant from the Air Force to research these objects? Apparently, it never came to pass. Somehow, it just got dropped, which I can imagine.
Yeah, it's not surprising.
Public relations scam, right? But that's why I thought it was funny that a gentleman from the Air Force Weapons Lab had recommended or suggested Paul put in for a grant. And it was coincidental because Lake Mirabeau, who saw Ray's film, after 1993, about the time I knew who he was, he had gotten a grant from the Air Force Research Lab to study his laser propulsion. Keep in mind, I do want to
Hmm.
stipulate, Mirabeau is a brilliant guy. This is the guy who saw Ray's film. And he's got some brilliant ideas at the time for laser propulsion, which is if you can take an object and fire an intense laser underneath it to cause the atmosphere under the object to basically explode, and you can keep doing that repeatedly, you can basically fly your object off into the sky with no fuel
With no
because you're
drag.
just
Yeah, no
firing.
anything.
And, yeah, and he got a grant to research that from the Air Force Research Lab under a man named Franklin Meade, and he was doing a lot of that research. I think it was at maybe not at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But needless to say, how he managed to get a grant from the Air Force Research Lab, the same place that conceivably has suggested Paul Benowitz maybe apply for a grant. This is just, I know Mirabeau got his grant because that's, you can, he and Franklin Meade almost went into business for themselves at one point. I guess Franklin Meade retired from the Air Force. And Mirabeau, strangely enough, seems to have just dropped off the face of the earth. I mean, I believe he's up somewhere like Virginia, somewhere right now. I've looked up some information on him and you can find something about him. But his whole idea for light, his idea was called a light craft because he had some small models that would use lasers to project under a conical, I guess, shaped rim underneath it that would concentrate the light to the point that the atmosphere would explode. And you'd see the images of the test he did where it'd go, as long as they could pulse that laser rapidly enough, it would just shoot that thing up into the
Hmm.
sky. I don't know how high they ever actually got. And that in itself doesn't have necessarily anything to do with the directed energy air spike out the front. But one thing I did notice was in his early light craft ideas, the light craft originally looked more like an acorn or the Apollo capsule. Apparently, he originally one time called it the Apollo light craft because he envisioned a 2 or 3 man object that would use lasers from the back of it. But pretty quickly, the sketches or the illustrations, one of them was on the cover, I think Popular Mechanics, showed an image of his light craft, but now it was a disc-shaped craft. And there were some other ones done for the NASA Breakthrough Propulsion Physics that actually did show a disc-shaped craft with a beam firing out the front. So his ideas extended well beyond just the light craft idea to using a combination perhaps of that and this directed energy air spike to
Hmm.
move the atmosphere out of the way. Because the drag reduction you get was substantial enough to make it worth doing if you had the energy to do it. Anyway, my whole point was simply, here's 2 films that have nothing to do with each other. Both guys, at least at one point, were suggested, in Benowitz's case, to apply for a grant from the Air Force Research Lab or Weapons Lab. Somehow or other, Lake Mirabeau does end up with a grant through the Air Force Research Lab, propulsion director, working very closely with Franklin Meade. But Mirabeau, unfortunately, in my opinion, like I said, when I wrote that first article, I left out the connection to Ray. I just showed you what Ray had filmed and what Mirabeau did and how similar they were. I left that little connection out just to avoid any heat for it. And Mirabeau never came out and acknowledged any of it. He never even, the one time I finally called him and talked to him on the phone because I wanted, hopefully, he and Ray to get together and maybe they could do something, come out with it. But his first question to me was, what's your vested interest in this? And I'm like, I don't have any other interest other than seeing Ray at least get the credit for what he deserved.
Hmm.
And if it's acknowledged that this is a propulsion concept that came from something else, we might all benefit. Maybe Mirabeau would get contracts or get grants or what, everybody would benefit.
Yeah, that's your vested interest, is the truth,
Yeah,
essentially.
the truth, essentially. And I don't know whether I feel good about the fact that ultimately arrangement was made for him to talk to Ray, but I wasn't in on the conversation. Not that I felt like I had the right to be in on it. But after the best that I heard was he offered to maybe at one of the conferences that he went to let Ray put some photos out in the hall and no audio to go along and explain what it is. And I'm like, wait, who's going to do that? Who wants to just put some pictures out in the hall? But anyway, he talked about it to Ray. And if that was the only thing he was willing to do for whatever reason, Ray declined it and it never went anywhere. I wish I'd been in on that conference call, that call now, just to hear exactly what went on. But needless to say, what I wrote about in the book is still correct. I mean, it's still true that he saw what Ray had on film and it got some ideas for a directed energy air spike.
So, what is common in this Mirabeau and Benowitz in their background that the Air Force would offer them a grant? Because they're not going to offer it willy nilly to some random Joe Schmo, are they? It strikes me of the whole thing of, oh, we found a crashed UFO here. Oh, you're a good company. Go and work out how this works. It strikes me of that.
Yeah, well, I would, as far as the whole idea of crash retrievals and whatnot, if we take for granted that there is such a thing right now, and I'm the Air Force, I'm open to public scrutiny, FYA, congressional oversight, whatever you want to call it. If we don't want, and I actually heard David Grush say this the other day, which is if you don't want the fact that you have got some technology or some ideas to get across to your enemy, you better be able to keep it quiet. You don't want them to even sniff it out because then they're all over you. So if a private company doesn't have to answer to anybody, or maybe stockholders, but it's just money. If you're a private company, nobody's going to FOI request what you've got. So if I was the government and I knew that a private company also may have far more better brains that they can hire and pay the money to, why wouldn't I work out some kind of agreement? I realize what I'm saying sounds like the whole Admiral Wilson scenario where he found some private company that he didn't name who they were, but that he went and talked to them and they could make some phone calls to somebody and tell him you don't have a right to know. So there's obviously a connection somewhere between if we're, the whole crash retrieval thing. I have a little difficulty with the crash part of it, not necessarily the retrieval part, because, a lot of people do make that. It doesn't mean crashes can't happen, accidents happen. But the whole idea that if you can get here from wherever you're going from, especially if it was extraterrestrial from wherever, you're going to come all this way and then just crash. That's hard to imagine technologically that they wouldn't also have some way to recover their own just to avoid, leaving people on the ground.
And that's a common thought, by the way. Everyone will play that angle.
Yeah.
And you can understand why, because it's the first question you would go to.
Exactly. My take, if I had to speculate, is we found things that maybe didn't crash, or maybe they were just left, intentionally. I mean, if somebody goes to the moon, look at the junk they're going to find that we've left all over the place that we never intended to get back, because we weren't thinking that way at the time. We were just going out there to do the best we can to get something there. I'm sure there's some asteroid floating around right now that's got some satellite we crashed into it just to see if we could actually hit one, and who knows where it's going to end up. With global warming and everything else, it's funny because these days the whole idea of the old original movie The Thing, where somebody just finds something that melted and was buried in the ice for 1,000 years. Who's to say over the history of this earth something doesn't thaw out and it's left in the ground at the bottom of a glacier? So it may not be a crash, but the idea of retrieving something, that's not hard for me to imagine. But if I wanted to be sure we get the most out of it, I might turn it over to a private company whose only connection is with some specific people, whoever you want to call them, people who've got inherent deniability, but no responsibilities, except that the company is going to get their money through working with these people. And I'd put it in the hands of a private company. And in fact, I would put it in the hands of someone like Lockheed, who's so far out in the middle of the desert somewhere. Good luck, anybody trying to just jump the fence and get to that. I mean, that would be my first.
I agree. I think loads of things would have been outsourced. It's a no-brainer, isn't it? For all the reasons you suggested. Now, going back to Benowitz, he's offered this money. Sorry, he's offered a grant.
Well, no, he was.
Where do we go from there?
To my knowledge, Benowitz was suggested. This is the best I can recall, that he apply for a grant.
Right.
I don't know whether he just didn't, or I don't know whether he did and it was declined. All I know is, for some reason, it didn't happen. There was, as far as I know, he was not given a grant.
Okay.
What also gets me, though, is this whole idea of pressure tactics. In other words, Benowitz's company was doing very well. they had contracts, to my understanding, with a whole lot of military services and government agencies through Thunder Scientific. If he was onto something, that if he had filmed something they didn't want him to talk about, simplest thing I think to do would be to go to the guy and say, this is a national security matter. You're not supposed to be taking films over the fence of this classified reservation anyway, but you've done this now. We want you to just drop it. Give us the films, hand them over, and we'll make sure your company has got contracts ad infinitum to last forever. Otherwise, we'll find some reason to be suspect of you, and we'll cut all your contracts overnight. That would be an easy thing to do. I mean, if you wanted to go that route. I mean, there's stories of the people up there at Rachel, Nevada, who were curious about the whole Lockheed and government, who were finding the little ground sensors buried in the ground and pointing them out. And I remember I wrote about this one in the book, where the guy was just filming them for his, I guess, YouTube channel or whatever he was doing, and comes home one day, 3 sheets of paper, a raid on his house, told all the equipment that they removed, and here's the list of your inventory. If you want them, you got to. And you know good and well, all that was a pressure tactic to keep the guy from poking around and exposing the stuff that was outside the perimeter, meaning it was on public land, but you're just making a trouble for yourself. I would think, and Benowitz was a patriotic guy. He wasn't, I mean, you know, he wasn't just some guy, an influencer trying to make waves on YouTube these days. And I think he probably would have, if they had honestly come to him and said, you stepped onto something, we need to keep quiet about it. If you want to know, we'll work out something. But
yeah,
I think he was a conscientious enough person that he would have done that. But his company never failed. Nobody ever, other than the Doty and Bill Moore and that whole mess of a charade that came down afterwards to try to defuse him. That's Bill Moore's term, to defuse Paul Benowitz. And the best way to do that was to make him look crazy. You make him look like a nutcase, so nobody's going to want to pay attention to him. Look, that's the same thing we have today.
So is this where the disinformation aspect of it comes in then?
Well, I have my opinions now of how it came about. No, I mean, don't need to go into it. I into some of that in the book, but I tend to think now that just about everything that came about after July or middle of 1980, remember I mentioned earlier, there seems to be this gap between any of the documentation. I don't know that we can ever find it now. Kirtland said they only kept things for 3 years, but you can find information on things that began to come out after about June or July of 1980. But in that time period in January, when he got his films and contacted Kirtland, and April, May, June, when you don't have any, I mean, supposedly Doty was talking to him. Where's the record of that? Where's the record of what Doty, who Doty was reporting to on that? We don't have any of that. But I know it was going on because Edwards had said he'd been up there and been at Paul's house several times. Doty had been there a couple of times, I believe, at least. But the first indication that I became aware of something that was unusual was a letter that was sent to APRO. It was called the Craig Wetzel letter. It was sent to APRO by a gentleman who claimed he had been in the service and had been at Kirtland on some training mission or something. And they were doing some training in the Pecos Mountains or somewhere up there where they were supposed to be. It was like if you're stranded after you bail out of a helicopter and you're perished on the ground and you're supposed to attract attention. But he and another guy that were there, they were all up on the side of this mountain and they saw a UFO basically. And there was some other stuff that they supposedly saw afterwards. But the guy wrote that after they got back to Kirtland, they were visited by a guy named Mr. Doty, spelled D-O-D-Y, not D-O-T-Y. And then the guy goes on to make this comment that while he was there, he had heard that there are certain things stored in the bunkers, in the Manzanos, that aren't nuclear weapons, something to that effect.
Right.
All I could get out of that was, this is basically somebody throwing a lure to APRO to get their attention up there at Kirtland. Because first thing I would have done, which eventually I did, was, who's this Doty character? Is there a Doty? I would have thought APRO would somehow immediately look into it, but apparently they didn't. Now, shortly before this time period, Bill Moore, who had moved to Arizona for family reasons, I think, and had become a special investigator, or the chief special investigator, something like this, for APRO, which was based in Tucson.
Can I just interject something here?
Yes, sure.
APRO, could you tell me what that stands for?
Okay.
You might have said it earlier, but I've literally forgotten if you have.
All right. Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, APRO,
Thank you.
founded by Jim and Coral Lorenzen, still considered one of the most reputable ones of all time. I think primarily because Coral Lorenzen didn't take a lot of crap from anybody.
Good.
But it was a very it was a well thought of organization by all accounts. But Paul Benowitz, as I mentioned, from early 1979, apparently when he'd been to the cattle mutilation thing, either I don't know whether he was a member or had kind of been writing to them, but I think he considered himself in some way affiliated with APRO. Because to my understanding, all during the time of after he got the films and when he began to meet these, Edwards and Doty and these guys, he was still writing some things back and forth to APRO, to Jim Lorenzen. The impression I've gotten is they didn't quite know what to do with him, how to approach it. But of all things, Bill Moore shows up, moves to Arizona, starts dealing with APRO, gets picked to be like their chief investigator. And I think he wrote about this in one of his, what was the name of his Focus or whatever little newsletter he used to put out. But one of the first things that happened was this letter that was this Craig Wetzel letter about the guy who'd been up there and mentioned that Doty character was given to Bill Moore to investigate. But apparently Bill claims he didn't, that never investigated it. So it's like, well, then how did he meet Richard Doty? That's is my opinion as of now. After when I was working on the book, trying to do the chronology of how all this happened, things just didn't add up for me. And I began to think, wait a minute. Bill has claimed that he was doing a book tour. I don't remember if it was the book he wrote with Charles Berlitz at the time on it, Roswell or another. Anyway, he had been doing some book tour on his way to a conference he was going to attend and was getting phone calls at the radio stations. This is his story, where he's he's doing a talk at radio stations along the way to promote his book. And he's getting phone calls from some characters saying, we think you're this one person we know of that we can deal with, or some things along that line. And then on his return, but he ignores them. But it's on the return leg, he happens to go through Albuquerque and apparently does another radio interview in Albuquerque, gets a similar kind of innocuous, mysterious phone call from someone, and apparently arranges to meet this person at a restaurant, coffee shop, whatever. And he's waiting in his car to see who walks in, and a tap gets on the window, and it's some guy that he meets, who they go and talk. And if my facts are slightly skewed, I'm working on memory here.
Oh,
but
okay.
apparently within 2 weeks, that person puts him in touch with Richard Doty. I'm like, wait a minute. So he's meets some guy after some mysterious phone calls in Albuquerque. And then this person, who is the first person to meet Bill, then later on, he comes back and meets, and he's putting in touch with Richard Doty. And I'm like, the same person you would almost certainly have found if you had made even a single phone call on that Craig Wetzel letter that APRO gave to you to investigate, but apparently you did nothing with it. But then within a few weeks, you're now sitting across the table from this guy. And then you develop some kind of an ongoing relationship with Richard Doty, where you're trying to keep your foot in the door to get information, but Doty is handing you material. And in the case of this, the one letter, I don't know if you ever heard of what was called, there's so much to this stuff that goes way back. There's a document called the NASA Telex, or the NSA Telex.
Nope, doesn't ring a bell.
Yeah, don't. This is unfortunately one of the
Kind of
things where I
worms.
think value old people who've been at things for a lot longer years than you have, because they've got a lot of the stuff. And I wish all of us would get. Anyway, the point was, this was a document that first document that ever mentioned MJ12. If you ask people, where did MJ12 come from? A lot of people ascribe it to Bill Moore and Jamie Chandray around 1983, who supposedly got a roll of film left on the doorstep for Jamie Chandray, something to this effect, and had some documents with this MJ12. No, The first time anybody ever mentioned MJ or ever saw MJ12 was in something that, for lack of a better term, was called the NASA telex, because in it, it had some mention of NASA having been involved in some things, but it describes some of the stuff Paul Benowitz had been doing, and it describes a guy named Miller and Fugit, two guys whose names actually exist, Jerry Miller, now fairly well known, another guy named Robert Fugit, who I believe worked at the Starfire optical range, if I'm not mistaken. But it so had good names in it, but it also mentions the results of Project Aquarius, something to the effect, I'm not quoting it right now, but are known only to MJ12. But it's MJ dash the number 12 spelled out, TWELVE, not abbreviated. Bill Moore claims that he was given that by Richard Doty, and this is, I think Bill Moore has written this. I say he's claimed this was supposed to have been written, and Bill Moore stated he was given this by Richard Doty with the idea that he was supposed to slip it to Paul Benowitz, and Paul Benowitz would run with it, and then at some point it would be diffused or whatever, disavowed, and it would blow Paul's credibility. According to Bill, he handed it to Paul, but said, I don't think I would trust this. I would, and apparently Paul did nothing with it, maybe to his credit. And so all of this disinformation that was put into this document about the results of Project Aquarius and MJ12 and NASA, which later on the story was Bill altered it slightly, that what says NASA originally said NSA, that he had just changed it a little bit so nobody could claim they had an original or whatever the case may be. Who can say anymore now as far as that's concerned? Unfortunately, it's been shown since all the way to 1989, and Bill admitted that he was pretty much working in cahoots with AFOSI and Richard Doty all this time to basically stuff Paul with as much disinformation as they could. And like, first off, something tells me that's probably illegal, that a government agency is not supposed to be targeting a civilian, a citizen. If not, where's the authorization for it? That sort of thing. But needless to say, I think ultimately it just pushed Paul over the brink between that and John Lear's getting involved and some other things that happened. And I did the best I could to put this out and document it all. If anybody wants the book, it's on Amazon, but I'll give you a copy of it to look through. But needless to say, there was a whole lot more involved than if it was just some guy who got some films of UFOs. And actually,
there's a second half of it, isn't it? It's not just an event. There's an attempt to discredit via a massive convoluted web of lies.
Yeah, and in fact, the odd thing is this: if you just looked at the photographs Paul took, or at least, and I'll be honest with you, Paul had even told me that the originals are far more colorful, show far more. What he sent me, with the photos that I've got, which are sitting right over there in a slide case, I took off of the still images that he sent me. So they're not the best. They're third generation or whatever you want to call it to begin with. But even then, just with what I can do in Photoshop and some of the software you've got, you can go in there and pull out enough detail on them, but they're still images of glowing objects on a dark background. The Air Force, my point is, the Air Force could have looked at it and said, just from a picture like that, you're not going to be able to prove where they were taken. If he wants to stand up and say, I took them in front of the White House, you can't tell from that. They could have just told him to go talk to MUFON and go away.
Of course. So weaving this whole web of lies and torrent of disinformation just tells you one thing. Why would you go to that effort unless there was some truth to the film in the first place? Plus, it's an obvious thing, isn't it?
Yeah, needless to say, Ernest Edwards knew Paul by that time. And to my understanding, and every time I talked to Ernest Edwards, except for one instance now when I think he was probably going along with what FOSI would have wanted said, he seemed like a very nice, decent guy. He knew Paul, never spoke bad of Paul at all, had been to Paul's house several times. And Paul's wife was out there, so it wasn't just a matter of saying Paul's lying if you wanted to go that route. You'd have to then bring into the fact that his wife was there too, and she saw these objects take off and fly, and Paul had 3 different types of film and equipment, not just one still shot of an image. Yeah. So I don't know, but why would you go that long for a guy unless there was definitely something that
of course
could not risk getting out?
Well, not even the time, it's the money you're paying those people to go and do it all. Seriously, as well. It's a serious resource, isn't it? You wouldn't waste resource in any forces.
And they went further than that to even go after Linda Howe at one point. The one time I talked to Richard Doty, information from Linda Howe at the time was that she had been handed some documents. The whole
Oh,
what
when
was it
she went
called?
and saw him in an interview room, that one.
Presidential briefing papers or something
Mm.
like this. And one of the times I talked to him on the phone, and I said, well, she said that you handed her some documents, that you reached in her drawer and handed these documents to her. And she had even told me that she felt like the chair she was sitting in was bugged because he wasn't saying a whole lot. But he came back and said, hey, two of my supervisors were there claiming like whatever he was saying was correct. And I got lucky, I guess, because I asked him, were they in the room? And he hesitated a minute. He said, well, one of them was right outside the door. And I'm like, wait a minute. So where the other one was, we don't really know, but you're in a room talking to Linda Howe and you have two supervisors and you monitoring this conversation. If there's nothing to it, I believe Linda Howe. I have no.
Oh,
I
yeah,
really
me too.
now. But that got the whole presidential briefing paper situation out there that took on life of its own, just like MJ12 did. So it's kind of the divide and conquer scenario. You throw enough chum out in the waters and the fish scatter to all points, and finally people aren't paying much attention to Paul anymore.
Exactly. Now that was going to be my follow-on question on this, which is simply why disinformation? And I think you've answered it with the chum in the water, and it takes eyes elsewhere, doesn't it, rather than on
I think
focus.
that's what's going on to this day, even with the films and the whole 2017. I mean, there are certain aspects of that just don't fly in my book in particular. I mean, the way things happened, especially starting all the way back to 2008, when the whole Bass OSAP thing allegedly began, and people tend to want to merge OSAP and ATIP to this day. And no, they're not the same thing at all. OSAP was just a name on a contract with the DIA. The people involved, when Harry Reid got involved, but you don't realize, but somehow, according to Lou Elizondo himself in his IG complaint, which none of us really know, I guess, whether he actually filed it or did he just get the documents and fill them out and then release them to Alejandro Rojas saying he'd filed it with the IG. Because I call the IG and they won't acknowledge yes or no anything if it's an active investigation. But presuming the information is correct, according to him, before the OSAP was even given to Bass in 2008, Stratton, who now Jay Stratton, everybody knows that name now, but not heard of at the time, Stratton in June had already contacted Elizondo and within a matter of weeks put him in touch with Lakatsky, the program manager. But the contract didn't come out until August, September, sometime August after that. And they were all, so apparently Stratton, whoever he was working for, was already aware that there was some kind of I guess, Bigelow and Harry Reid project in the works that was going to be called OSAP, and Lakatsky was going to manage it. That they would put Lou Elizondo in touch with Lakatsky as to kind of run security on the whole thing. That tells me, wait a minute. So Harry Reid's not classified, but very closely held OSAP idea that he and Bigelow were working out, that got $22 million. The whole reason Bigelow formed Bass to get the contract, that you had Hal and Eric Davis and all of these people that were involved at the time. And in fact, that's what ATIP was these guys, in my way of looking at it. Most of the people I know, we talk about them as the Saucerdoodle Knights for a reason, but the point is that small group of internal people, Hal, Eric Davis, Colm Kelleher didn't get there until later, but I'm sure he probably was in on it. Jacques Vallée, Kit Green. If you don't know the name Kit Green, look him up. This is where it gets deep. I'll back up because I don't mean to go way off on a tangent. So if you want to keep on what you're talking about, let me know. But the point of it is, Kit Green was this. You've heard of people talk about the X-Files at the CIA, the weird desk. Okay. All the way back from the late 60s and 70s, Kit Green, who at the time was working that area, among other things, I'm sure, and had gotten to know Hal Puthoff, he ends up involved with the same group that's doing Bass. But he's not officially on their payroll or on the roll, the list of employees at all. But all the way back to when Bigelow was running NIDS back in the late 90s, Kit Green, according to Jacques Vallée, Kit Green was the director of NIDS, but you don't see his name anywhere on there, on the team of people involved. Everybody else's name seems to be there. When Tom DeLonge first started talking to his Air Force generals, is what he says he started with, and this would have been around 2015, if I'm not mistaken. He's talking to a couple of Air Force guys in particular. And this is after he met the guy at Lockheed. If you read the inside the foreword of his book, Secret Machines, he talks about how he had gone to a Lockheed party, but his conditions for going was he gets 5 minutes with the top guy at Lockheed. You know, ballsy move. I'll give him that.
Yeah, I would say.
And I mean, I like Tom DeLonge's music. I'll give him that. But needless to say, not too long afterwards, he's getting involved with these Air Force generals. And the guy who's the top guy at Lockheed calls or talks to Tom DeLonge and says, you need to meet this guy. There's some guy to meet. You need to go to this restaurant outside the Pentagon. So I'm thinking Tom DeLonge was probably in California at the time. If he's going to fly all the way to this restaurant outside the Pentagon to meet somebody he doesn't know, that he later on calls his CIA man. And the description is Kit Green. I think eventually he's acknowledged that it was Kit Green. But the Lockheed guy shows up there too. So I'm like, wait a minute. How did the Lockheed guy, who even told the Lockheed guy to get Tom DeLonge to fly all the way to a restaurant outside the Pentagon, near the Pentagon, to meet Kit Green? And why Kit Green? What was his, within a couple of weeks, according to WikiLeaks, I've read too much of this stuff, but according to WikiLeaks, Tom DeLonge has to go down to Texas to meet two very important people, or some very important people. A friend of mine mentioned, well, that's almost certainly Hal Puthoff, because he was running, down the Earth Tech down in Austin at the time. But then you have Kit Green, according to Tom DeLonge, after the meeting, saying things like this don't happen in the halls of power. Things like this happen when people like us get together to kick the can down the field. Something very innocuous, mysterious like that. Then Jim Simivan. When Bass got started, it was Tom DeLonge, Hal Puthoff, and Jim Simivan as co-founders. Jim Simivan, who, if you look at his bio on To the Stars, said he had retired from the CIA like 15 years ago or something like this. But in an interview that he did, he stated that, yes, he took a year or so off, but then he went back to work for the CIA, I guess part-time or whatever they call it, and worked for them for like the next 13 or more years. And he claimed that he and a couple of guys at one point flew out to San Diego to meet Tom DeLonge because of some things that Tom DeLonge had written in Secret Machines that they thought sounded like maybe there was a leak somewhere. But then he gets out there and says, no, that he figured there was no leak. Tom DeLonge's just a very brilliant guy. But then they meet the next morning for breakfast and Hal Puthoff shows up. And they work out, like on a napkin or whatever, over breakfast, the outline of how To the Stars should be set up. Okay, so Tom DeLonge meets the person he calls a CIA man in 2015, but that's Kit Green. And almost certainly Kit Green puts him in touch with Hal Puthoff. But then somewhere along the line here, Jim Simivan, who's back working for the CIA, I don't know that he still is now, but I calculated the 12, 13 years from the time that he was talking about in his interview. And in 2017, let alone 2015, he would have still been functionally, I think, representing them in some ways, that he and a couple of guys are sent out to California to talk to Tom DeLonge, ostensibly because of some leak that they figured out pretty quickly there's no leak. It's just Tom DeLonge. But then they help. So you have the CIA guy helping Tom DeLonge sketch out the basics for To the Stars. And Hal Puthoff is there. And I'm like, and then if you've ever seen one of Lou Elizondo's first conferences that he did right after he came out and became publicly known, he was at, I don't know if it was a MUFON conference somewhere, and he gave a talk. It's on YouTube. But afterwards, someone in the audience asked him, well, after Bigelow's $22 million Harry Reid's money ran out in 2012 or whenever it supposedly did, asked Lou Elizondo, how did you keep working once the money ran out? And he said, I kept working with help from the Navy and the CIA. I wonder why the Congress isn't all over that, especially since, from everything I've seen, Stratton came out of O&I, working with O&I. I don't know if he was working directly with them in 2008 when he went and found Elizondo. You may have heard Elizondo say that he first got met by some people who asked him, "So what do you think about UFOs?" And he said, "Well, I don't think anything about them. Well, I don't think about him at all," something like this. Well,
Hmm.
now he says that was Jay Stratton who asked him that. So was Stratton still working for O&I at the time? So when Lou Elizondo gets brought in, especially after Lukotsky claims he's going to be out of the picture and he's going to hand it off to Lou to run ATIP, Lou's working with the Navy and the CIA. Something tells me To the Stars was not just a clean bunch of guys deciding they want to run this thing, especially when they were found out to begin with that Harry Reid's putting up getting $22 million and Bigelow's starting this program, ostensibly not about UFOs, but even Harry Reid has said everybody knew it was a UFO program from the beginning. I happen to have the email that tells me from somebody I trust implicitly that the event occurred in 2004, the Nimitz incident.
Mm-hmm.
And then we don't hear anything more about until the ATIP or the Harry Reid and Bigelow start something up in 2007. But from what I hear, which I'm solid belief on it because I got the email from the person, Harry Reid actually had told Bigelow about the Nimitz event in 2005, not long after it occurred. And that apparently Hal Puthoff and somebody else were a couple of the people that were there who heard it. And Bigelow told them, is the point. Bigelow told them that Harry Reid had already told him about this Nimitz event. But for whatever reason, Bigelow, nothing happened until 2007, when suddenly we hear the beginnings of what Hal Puthoff and those people now say, oh, it all started in 2007. I'm, for me, convinced that it was Kurth, who was one of the pilots involved in the Nimitz incident, not with Fravor himself, but he was out there flying above them, who had moved to Las Vegas and began to apply for work at Bigelow Aerospace. And knowing Bigelow was interested in UFOs, almost certainly told them about his experience
Fed in
out
the
there
story.
because
Okay.
he moved out there in the first few months of and he emailed me about this. I was fortunate. He didn't like talking to me for whatever reason, but he was nice enough to reply, filled me in on it, that he had moved to Las Vegas and began to apply to Bigelow Aerospace. Apparently did an interview of some sort because by November, and I learned this from going to his LinkedIn site, it shows in November of 2007, keep in mind, Bass, the name Bass that Bigelow used, wasn't even registered until 1st of 2008. So Kurth lists his time working for Bigelow starting at the end of 2007. The contract, the OSAP contract, didn't come out until August, almost a year later. So he's hired to work at Bigelow, and we don't really know doing what. My thinking is when he began to apply and Bigelow was going to hire him in, and Bigelow talks to Hal and everybody else, and they get all this stuff started, and they get with Harry Reid, and now Harry Reid says, fine, I'll get you 22 million or however much. The ball starts rolling. They get Kurth working, and he's starting to make calls investigating the Nimitz case. I don't know this for sure because he won't talk to me anymore, but I have a feeling that somewhere along the line, the cat got out of the bag, that Bigelow is doing an investigation. Even Fravor has said he got a call from his buddy Cheeks Kurth at one point in 2008, I think, where he said, yeah, we have somebody who wants to investigate this stuff. But remember I mentioned that somehow in June of 2008, Stratton had already gone to contact Lou Elizondo to get him involved in this stuff because he was going to introduce him to Lukotsky, and Lukotsky was going to run the whole $22 million program. So if he was with O&I, somehow Stratton had to have learned that there's going to be this investigation or there's going to be a $22 million project here coming up, that he goes in contact. So somehow the cat got out of the bag is all I'm getting at. Somehow before the OSAP contract came out, the Navy, maybe even the CIA, somebody already knew it was coming because they contacted Elizondo before it ever came out. So they knew it was going to happen.
So what are you saying, that all the American forces stuff, all these videos coming out was seeded to come out on purpose? Is that what you're saying?
Well, by the time they came out, and since Elizondo, in his IG complaint form, which I've got a copy of, anybody get a copy of it, apparently he gave it to Alejandro Rojas, who put it out there. Now it's come out with some of the redactions, cleared out. He's the one who said that in June of 2008, he was approached by Jay Stratton and somebody else. That name's been blacked out, who were the ones who asked him, what do you think about UFOs? That tells you right there. The whole point was UFOs from the beginning. It was not, what do you think about consciousness or Skinwalker Ranch? What do you think about, Lou's response was, I don't think about him at all, or something to that effect. Apparently they had another meeting with him somewhere in the next week or two, but pretty quickly put him in touch with James Lakatsky. And he was there apparently to be in charge of security, as if Lakatsky's working for the DIA. Don't they have their own security for their own projects, for their own programs that they're monitoring? Why would you need to get somebody, Lou Elizondo, who apparently knew nothing about anything, as far as we're told, that you get Jay Stratton in, who apparently has the clout to pick Elizondo and then go to Lakatsky at the DIA and say, this guy's going to be in charge of security? That's hard for me to follow right there, because I would think Lakatsky would find his own security guy, if he's managing the program. But all this is happening before the contract is even put out for bids. Nobody's supposed, I would think, right? Nobody's supposed to even know there's a contract going to come out yet. But they're already getting Elizondo in charge, and they know Lakatsky's going to manage it. Something tells me there was a leak from somewhere, or somebody upstairs found out pretty quickly what's going on, and that it's going to end up going to Lakatsky, and he's going to manage this contract Harry Reid has got money for, that Bigelow is going to manage, or that Bigelow Aerospace, BAS, Bass is going to handle. So that tells me right there, somebody knew. I'm curious about the fact that if the contract was written to make it sound like it's not UFOs, that it's advanced aerospace weapon systems applications, but they wrote the contract to make it sound that way, when in fact behind the scenes it was really Harry Reid's and Bigelow's UFO program, how that would fly with the management. I mean, from what I've understood, Lakatsky, even though the program supposedly was making headway, the DI eventually pretty quickly wanted to kill it, wanted to get their hands off of it. They didn't want to deal with it anymore, which may have been at some point why it died out. But I've wondered if Bigelow and Harry Reid and Hal, who supposedly wrote the bid for the proposal for the contract, if all of those people were found out to have known that what they were contracting behind the scenes had nothing to do with what the paper said, that it was a UFO program, would they have gotten in hot water with somebody for that? Would Harry Reid have gotten in hot water taking taxpayer money? If it came out that you got taxpayer money ostensibly for this advanced aerospace weapon systems app, but really it was you and Bigelow's pet project, $22 million you gave to your constituent Bigelow to do a UFO program. Is that deceptive? I think there could be some journalists who could write a really interesting article that way. I've wondered, I don't want to make a case for it, but I've wondered if that would have gotten a lot of people over the barrel. If you could have gone to them and said, you guys got 22 million for what you wrote on paper was this kind of project, but that's not what it was for. So you really, I don't want to use the fraud word there, but could that have put the fear into some of those people that now the Navy and the CIA are going to run the show, and Elizondo is going to take over, and you're going to do what we say, and we're going to give him 3 videos, because you're now, and the big stink was the Nimitz case was it from the very beginning. When Bigelow came out and the Bass and all that kind of stuff, even when To the Stars started, the Nimitz case was the cause célèbre of everything. We didn't hear any other UFO cases. Kurth was investigating the Nimitz case. He called Fravor about it. The Nimitz case was involved. When the New York Times stories first came out at the end of 2017, focused on the Nimitz case. And the Nimitz case, especially with the pilot witnesses, that's some credible witnesses. That, man, talk about wanting to kill kill Benowitz's story. That's a story you'd want to kill as well, because you've got not only that Kevin Day, you've got the radar operators, you've got the whole Nimitz crew, everybody else out there. And I'm thinking, could you have found a way to manage the ATIP, the OSAP program, the contract on your own, which is one of the reasons why I was curious. The 10-month report that we had all heard about, if you've seen things been written about, supposedly came out because every 10 months of a government contract, apparently, you've got to submit a report of what you've done and what you've accomplished to justify, are you going to get the next year's money? Well, the 10-month report would have come out right about the June of 2000 and I don't remember what we're talking about here, 2009, which is exactly the time Harry Reid reportedly sent a letter to the head of the DOD or the DIA wanting to change it into a classified special access program. I'm like, wait a minute. By all accounts, the 10-month report was a glowing review. According to what I've read, that Lukotsky and others said they were doing a good job of it. So if Harry Reid's getting his money's worth, and Bigelow's Bass guys are doing a good job of it, why would Harry Reid suddenly want to turn the whole thing over to be under the control of the DOD as a special access program? And that has bothered me, because to me, that was a turning point. After that, even though the contract allegedly kept going for another year or 2 or 3, we've not seen any other 10-month reports. We've heard nothing else of anything else that came about after that first year. I mean, fellas, in my opinion, my thinking is somebody took control of it. Maybe the CIA and the Navy or whomever else Elizondo was reporting to, and whoever Stratton had been assigned to this by when he went and found Elizondo, somebody wanted this thing contained. And that's my take on it. I actually have written several papers along the same line that you can find on my website.
I saw those. I did look at them. But I'm gonna say the same thing when I read them as I'm about to say to you now. All that stuff you've just mentioned there is incredibly hard to unpack, because you've hit me with a lot of information, and
you're right.
I know a lot of it, but you've hit me with like another 200 or 300%.
No, I understand. And in case you don't have some background, you haven't been there. I mean, I read plenty of scientific articles, and halfway through them, I'm like, what? It's full of math, or it's full of something, and they've lost me.
Well, and
I agree.
There's a lot of abbreviations as well, right? And I know them, but I imagine a lot of people listening to this may not. But even I got lost, and that's not me being disrespectful. That's a lot of information to take on. It is. May I ask you a question? To boil all that down, what are you saying? Are you saying that the tapes themselves are of real events, but just behind the scenes, how it's been managed or disseminated, that information is different? Or are you saying the events themselves could be something else?
I think at this point, the Nimitz events, as first discussed by Kevin Day, what Fravor saw, what Dietrich saw, what Kurth was above them, he couldn't see the object, but he heard the conversation. That event, I think, occurred. Now, do I know if they saw an ET or a time traveler? Who knows? But what the description of what they observed, I think, was correct. In fact, because the first reports that were written, that one came out by Paco Chierici, I believe, the X-Files edition that was released, which was basically involved a lot of the same stuff. Fine. The videos, the go fast, which is basically just a little white dot, and you see the target. What are we going to prove with that? Nothing. A little white dot against an ocean background.
Exactly. Yeah.
As I said, that has no wow factor, and we don't know what it is. The gimbal video, which is released with some audio that suggests there were other things there that may be true. Once again, all we have is an odd shape of something with nothing more to sink your teeth into. So it doesn't prove or disprove anything as far as I can tell. To me, it doesn't have a whole lot of wow factor. It's intriguing. Okay, just like the go fast. But it's mainly only intriguing because that's what was brought, those two, we'll get to the FLIR one here in a minute, were brought out by Elizondo as some kind of evidence or proof of something. So we think it'd be like if the Arrow office today came out and said, here's a video we can't explain. Well, everybody's going to imbue it with some credence because those guys said they can't explain it. But it might be anything. I mean, to make the point, like I said earlier, Ray's got some films that I can see what he's talking about. But you talk about how convoluted some of the articles are in the conversation and having this, but the average person has nothing to, I mean, what can you do with them? The FLIR video, the FLIR 1 video, which is the only one of the three that ostensibly came from the Nimitz time period back then. I was in a conversation, another podcast a year ago or so. And the point is, the only reason that one is especially, I think, meaningful to people is because it's supposed to have been the video taken by Chad Underwood. That's, now keep in mind, and everybody realizes this though, that's not Fravor's video. That's not the film of what he saw. That's a film taken by Chad Underwood, who was the flight group that went out after Fravor had returned. Realistically though, we don't have any evidence that's actually Chad Underwood's video. There's nothing on the video that says pilot Chad Underwood. And I made that point in a conversation with others. You can look at it and the screenshot shows what appears to be the readout from the screen showing flipping back and forth. And there's an interesting point here to make too, which is Chad Underwood was what's called the backseater, the weapons systems officer, although in the Navy, I think it's just the naval flight officer. He wasn't the pilot in the front seat. So he's in the back looking at those screens. Maybe the pilot in the front can as well. But the point is, those were two-seater aircraft. But there's nothing in that video that we can actually look at that proves beyond any doubt that that's actually his video. Would it be difficult for you or me or somebody who had their hands on a screen video to either blur an image or to make one up that looks a lot like it? Maybe. I guess these days Hollywood can do that easily. If I wanted to. And I'm not suggesting it. I'm just stating that the reality, the truth is, there is no evidence that's his video to begin with. Secondly, some part of me says, as much money as we spend with Raytheon to develop that kind of a TV monitoring system, you get a sharper video picture these days with your iPhone.
Yeah.
It's so blurry anyway. I would think if they're going to want to be able to identify an aircraft, if it's a Chinese or Russian aircraft, you're going to want as sharp a video as you can. Now, I understand people say, oh, it's been reduced or compressed or whatever else, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. Yeah.
But even so, just makes matters worse. So we have even less to look at, but absolutely zero proof that it's Chad Underwood's video. But everybody says it is. The reason I make the stipulation, this is my thinking, although right now I have seen zero evidence because nobody will talk to me. I hate to say it, but obvious reasons. I don't think, well, let me back up. The reason I made the stipulation of the backseater, Chad Underwood being the weapons officer who's monitoring, controlling all of that, is because Fravor himself, when he's been asked about the video, typically just says, well, we have helmet camera on, but I didn't turn it on because you're moving your head around and you get dizzy when you're
watching it back. Yeah, it's awful.
But that's not the gun camera. The point is the gun camera, which is mounted, on the turret underneath, which is what, and you can actually see some of this in the Chad Underwood video. When the plane maneuvers, you can actually, if you watch, you can see the background kind of rotate. And if you can find this online anyway. But Fravor was the pilot. There are only three people. We have Fravor, we have Dietrich, the pilot of the other aircraft. We have, forgive me right now, I've gone blank, Jim Slate, who was Dietrich's backseater, her weapons systems officer in their plane. They were the ones that stayed and circled above Fravor when he went down for the encounter. Fravor's backseater was a gentleman named Josh Apizzato. Never heard from him. Nobody's talked to him. He's gone on to have a very, very good career in the Navy. I think he's now in charge of the Air Fleet refit of the Nimitz in dry dock or whatever else. And I think for a while he was stationed up there in Alaska somewhere, but he was the backseater. And there are a couple of things that I've seen and things that I've read said, one by Fravor himself, one by Alex Dietrich, that tend to make me think Fravor got a video all right. Or Fravor may not have gotten it. Josh Apizzato in the back seat is the one who got the video. If he's the one controlling the cameras or controlling the, whatever you want to call it. So maybe technically Fravor saying he didn't get video is literally technically true. But in one of the very first interviews Fravor did when he was on Joe Rogan's show, he talks about when they landed back on the ship and went to the ready room, that he sent his backseater down to the intelligence center because he's second in command. Why should Fravor do it? He'll send him down to go do it because they go to do a debrief, apparently standard process. Fravor and them were waiting to see when someone would come and interrogate them, I guess after what they had encountered, they expected. And when nothing happened, he says not long after that, I guess maybe Underwood came back, but Fravor said he went down there to the ready room and he told them, I want my tapes. You got 2 minutes to give them to me or I'm going to tear this place apart. He went down to get his tapes. He said, I want my tapes. And apparently the story was he went back, made a copy, and he signed one of them whole for CO and locked it in the safe. That sure sounds like he's talking about his tape, not Chad Underwood's, because Chad Underwood left on a flight after Fravor got back. So Chad Underwood would have still been out there flying around on his shift. So when Fravor went down and said, I want my tapes and you're going to give them to me, and if the captain doesn't like it, you can tell him to talk to me. I looked into it, and apparently Fravor was almost on an equal level with the captain of the Nimitz, because Fravor was in charge as the captain of his flight squadron,
flight group,
kind of an independent thing. Doug Kurth was the Marines captain in charge of the Marine squadron. So he and Fravor were kind of on a level. Kurth is the one who apparently the first story began to come out that a lot of this occurred, but the story was Kurth was already out there when they called out and said, go check on this, whatever Kevin Day said that they saw an object out there, go check on it. But then they said they called him off. I found out he was still circling around them when Fravor was coming out. Apparently Kurth had some issue. He was free-flighting a plane that they had some work done on or something. So he couldn't, for the moment, he couldn't just go ahead and do it. That's when Fravor was coming. So they sent Fravor out there instead. But Kurth was above them the whole time. He said, we landed back on the ship at the same time. We were all still in our flight gear. So Kurth was well aware of all of this stuff as well. But Kurth was in a single seater, so he didn't have a backseater. But needless to say, why would Fravor say, I went down to the intelligence center and said, I want my tapes back? The tapes actually did belong to the flight because they had to reuse them conceivably. That's why he made a copy, because they were having to reuse them. They had to pay for them. So they belonged to the Fravor's flights. The second part that got interesting to me, though, was there was a document that came out that was an interview with Alex Dietrich that took place, I believe, in early 2017 sometime. I'm trying to recall right now exactly when that came out. I know it was, part of it was released on the To the Stars website, but had the names kind of blacked out. But later on, a copy came out that had all their names: Dietrich, Fravor, Slate, Apizzato. There was a meeting that took place at a restaurant. I don't think they named the actual people who invited her to this meeting. It was like 2 industry individuals and 2 government individuals. Who was there? Not sure of. But this is a transcript of this meeting. And so I'm assuming somebody either was fast shorthand taking notes right there while she was talking, or somebody recorded it and retyped it out later, because it goes that way. It looks like a transcript. In that meeting, there's a point at which they ask her about it, and she says that Fravor got angry when nobody came to talk to them, and he slammed the door of the ready room and locked it and made a copy of the tape from his Excuse me 1 second. Let me
It's all
put
right.
this on hold. I have no idea who's calling me. Some junk person now. Sorry. Anyway, but she makes the statement in that interview that Fravor locked the door and made a copy of his gun camera tape. Not helmet cam, not nothing, but stipulating his gun camera tape. Not Underwood.
Okay. So
So I have
ultimately, sorry, go,
two
carry on.
statements. No, I'm just saying two statements, one by Fravor, one by Dietrich, that I don't see any wiggle room in there when they're talking about his tape. So there's got to be a tape somewhere. And my thinking is the Fleur one video, the other videos, those are red herrings thrown out there. That's the chum in the water or in the chicken yard. So everybody goes over there and gets busy and occupied. And a lot of people these days, I still think probably a lot of people think that that Fleur one video was maybe Fravor's tape. They're not clear that it was Chad Underwood's tape.
Hmm.
You know, the other thing, and then I'll shut up about this. The other part, well, the other part about the Fleur one tape that's confusing to me is if Chad Underwood is out there, and I had to do a little looking to see what the flight speeds are on these aircraft, what's the landing speed, you know, and they
Hmm.
land at like 140, 150 knots, whatever it is. If you look at the video, the Fleur one video, which from what I understand, he couldn't see it with his eyes. They were filming it with a gun camera, something maybe 20 miles away. But this is supposed to be whatever Fravor saw, right? They're following this tic tac,
Mm-hmm.
but he never speeds up. Wouldn't you want to catch it? I mean, Fravor immediately at least made the dive down there to try to get close to see what it was. But they're flying along at like 250 knots, just tooling along and filming this thing out there. And not once do you see him going to afterburner or anything, to which you would think, why wouldn't you? If you don't know what it is, get up
I think
close.
me and you would think that way, but I just don't know whether forces people would think that way, you know, because they almost think in a different way to us, in that they're logical, cold, and they have to do what they're told. So maybe they had a flight plan. I don't know, but
Well, that's why I said it just kind of surprises me. I would think
yeah,
he's flying along at basically cruising altitude as though he's not. You're right. The point is, these are just questions.
yeah, and they're valid
The
questions.
questions I
Everything,
have that
yeah.
people don't seem to want to address.
I think
So
every question you've come up with on this is completely valid and is worth investigating. Why not? If you've got a question, answer it, move on. So I'm with you on that. I've heard, obviously, not obviously, but I have heard that there are better images and videos of these whole encounters. Hopefully, one day we'll see them. They're meant to be coming out, weren't they? A few years ago, they said they'd be out in a few years.
well, and that I think is part of the disinformation. I mean, the way I feel
Hmm.
now, and as I expressed to you in the emails, this whole thing has gotten so frustrating to me that I don't really hold much hope for us getting any kind of satisfaction or seeing anything because even and I mean, you even in the UK would have to agree, if you had a secret that might beat all other secrets, best bet is don't let anybody even know you've got it. Then they won't come trying to steal it.
Correct.
If we had this kind of technology over here, considering the way the world is these days, yeah, why not keep it to yourself and, and surprise them when they, that you've got it.
Control is
And,
power,
and
as they say.
yeah, and unfortunately, that cuts us all out of being invited to the party because
I know.
why would they tell us,
And I'm so desperate to go to that party. I bought a new frock and everything.
and, I mean, I tend to, gosh, the way our population is that, you got 15 minutes of airtime and then everybody's on to something else. My take on it is if they announced that, ETs or whomever, we now know that there's some other intelligent civilization that's out there and has capabilities beyond. Well, tomorrow everybody's going to have to still go to work. You're
I've
still going
said
to
the
have to
same
work and get
thing
a paycheck.
myself. Nothing
Everybody's
would
going to
happen.
go, nothing will, it's almost like 9/11 at every other part of the world except New York. It starts a big uproar, but people still go to work and they still watch the news. And eventually, if nothing changes desperately, in 2 weeks, we'll all be back partying
Yes.
on Friday nights. So,
Life goes on, as they say.
yeah.
Let's just expand on that minute. Going forward, right? Let's just say disclosure has happened, whether you call it soft or hard or whatever, it happens. Do you agree that there should be an amnesty at that stage where we would look historically at these figures that were all involved and say, all right, we forgive you for whatever things you've done, let's move on. Everything has to be truth from now on. Do you agree with an amnesty, or should we get
Well,
them?
I'm caught on the word. What exactly is there? Blanket amnesty, or is there amnesty within? Yeah, because to me, there's the point. We see in video podcasts people have done, and even others, even in a David Grush interview recently that was done with a couple of older guys from some European, which I like the guys, but they brought up this idea that people may have been killed or injured to keep this quiet.
Yes.
And I'm like, okay, so who authorized that? I mean, it's like in the case of Germany and the Nazis, we didn't need to go after every single soldier that was out there. Maybe some of them deserved, getting the treatment, but whoever was authorizing it and putting those people in a position, and I'm thinking primarily right now of in the Benowitz case, for example. Doty has made it clear in other interviews, I guess, that it wasn't just him involved. Like I even mentioned the time he said there were two of the supervisors were there, but he had told another friend of mine, that sometimes there'd be 100 AFOSI guys and they'd be going to all to the UFO conferences. All right. Individually, do I want bad things to happen to them? No. But whoever sanctioned 9-10 years of suffering on Paul Benowitz and his family because somebody had a secret that they couldn't just go to the guy and tell him up front. You know what? I'll be honest with you. Maybe they did. Maybe they went to his family and said, we're sorry, this is what happened. This is how desperate things were. But he wouldn't keep his mouth shut or whatever you want to call it. And we weren't going to bump him off. But what else can we do? Maybe they did. I'm not saying they didn't, And in that case, though, I would think that kind of an amnesty question. I mean, I don't think very highly of Richard Doty, not only because he tends to get argumentative when you confront him with facts that are inconvenient for him, his position, but he goes on other shows with other people and just keeps contributing to the same disinformation that he's been nailed on. And in my case, I'm 99% certain he was pretending to be another person who was there's an appendix at the back of my book that has to do with a site over in Laos and Cambodia back during the Vietnam War, Lima Site 85. And a commander of the site that I happened to come across something suggesting that Doty had been there. And when I finally reached the commander of the site and asked him about it, what threw me was he knew Richard Doty, but he claimed Doty had never been at his site, at that site over in Laos. It came down to a History Channel. You do enough digging at nights when you're sitting by yourself, and I stumbled across some comment on a History Channel by Doty using an email address of his, where he claimed to have been at this site and a second site that was basically run by the CIA back during those days. And I'm like, I don't see how he was old enough. But so I contacted this. They actually have a website, Lima Site 85 website, because it was overrun by the Viet Cong at the time. And the commander, I'm like, well, how in the heck do you even know Richard Doty? I mean, how would 1,000,000 to 1 you would know this name of this person I'm asking about if he was never at your site? Because he's claiming to have been there. Whoa, I was ready to publish my book, and it stopped everything for a year to ferret all this out. And Doty having claimed to have been at this site, and his cousin was at some site down there working for the CIA in southern part of the state. And it was a whole big rigmarole that involved, I won't go into it now because it's all spelled out. But the point to me is, I don't know whether Doty is simply running loose like we seem to have happening now with Elizondo and now Jim Simivan and everybody else. They become a hot item for a while and then they resign. Or all the ones at To the Stars principally had resigned just beforehand. Even who was the Lockheed engineer who was a main figure and was on their TV show Unidentified, but he had worked for Lockheed, and within a few weeks of To the Stars coming out, he resigned from Lockheed. Elizondo resigned. They all resigned, and now they're supposedly free because they're no longer speaking officially. And I don't know whether that's part of the, of the gimme to, once you resign, you can go out there and be at all the conferences and make a buck any way you want and write a book and it's all yours. As long as you stick to the story that we're trying to propagate. So I don't know.
So anyway, I'm with you on that, by the way. But amnesty, you would be selective of it. People like Doty or Doty or however we want to say it wouldn't get it.
If there were people who have got serious harm, if it was just to me, I would say, fine. What's the grounds for amnesty? Is it that this secret was so important that at the time, the people who were doing this stuff were worried about, okay, I can understand it. That's plausible. And in that particular case, if it was a matter of, if you come out of, like right now, the whole whistleblower thing, if you come out right now and you blow the whistle and you tell Congress, like David Grush has supposedly done, I'm conflicted on Grush too, because they're all blowing the whistle, but I don't hear anything. It's not Edward Snowden, who came out and spelled it out and told you what was what. And look where he is now. I think we should bring him back. But he at least spilled the beans. You knew the NASA programs. He documented it. He carefully didn't want to hurt anybody, but he proved that what he was saying had teeth. In other words, it was valid. These other people come out whistleblowers, but then when you ask them a hard question or ask them, well, Grush has at least said he's told them this information in the closed briefings.
That's right, in a skiff or whatever they call it.
Yeah, but then the NASA administrator supposedly came out and said, well, when they had Grush talking to them, basically, even behind closed doors, everything he was telling them was just something he heard from somebody else. It was hearsay. He didn't have any actual, and he acknowledges to some extent that he's not first-person knowledge, but that he can tell you who the people were who worked on those programs and give you their names. If he had come out to the New York Times and laid that out there, told us which companies, like you mentioned earlier, which private industry companies are actually doing this and who's doing it at those companies, that'd be blowing the whistle. Now, would Grush deserve amnesty? I'd give it to him. If somebody would come out and acknowledge that, yes, I don't have a problem with amnesty. But
where it's due.
Yeah. Once again, it's how much forgiveness are they going to need from the families of people who were actually maybe physically injured? And if they got away with it and we didn't know that the guy was hurt because of something along this line, everybody, like they said, he got hit and killed in a car wreck. Well, anyway, that's a good question, though. Yeah. But I'll leave it to the people who are going to have to make that decision when the time comes.
To do it, exactly, when the time comes, and hopefully it does. I'm going to ask you one more question before we hit the Koit zone, and then we'll wrap it up, because I think we've probably gone over our time, and I don't want to keep you too long. But do you think, has technological progress, i.e. like internet and phones and stuff, have they helped or hindered disinformation and getting to the truth?
It's funny you mentioned that, because I remember the days when you had to pay for long distance phone calls and you rang up the bill. I don't think there's any way to say it has not helped, because communication can be instant, and you hear about things that are plenty of places that you never would have before, and you can access information. For example, a famous case that I'm looking for artwork reason, I do artwork on some of this kind of stuff, from France, from way back in 1965, I think, was the Valençol case. Massey, you should look that one up, where he had a field. He was a farmer with a field of lavender plants. And one morning early, heard some noise and came around the corner and saw this large rugby ball shaped object with a couple of beings by it. The point is, though, just the other day, I realized now, GEPAN over in France, their committee, has put a lot of the police reports, the gendarme reports, are available online. And suddenly I can go and download the PDF with some handwritten notes and some typed up notes. It's in French. I had to go to Google translate the whole thing as slowly as I could. But you can actually go get the reports that were done by the police investigators within 2 or 3 days of the incident, where they interviewed him themselves. And it changed my perspective on how I think that thing has been portrayed today, and what Massey, was the witness, was saying initially that day when it occurred. I believe it still occurred, but a detail, maybe a minor one, maybe a major detail or two, that That's not what he was saying at the beginning. It wasn't until a month and a half later, when it was all popular and the notoriety was out there, that suddenly the story changed a little bit, maybe to be a little bit more, have a little more zinger
Embellished.
value. Yeah, embellished to it. Maybe it was true, maybe it wasn't. But that's not what he was saying to the police. And the things that he was saying, embellishment later on, could have been said at the beginning. It wouldn't have made a difference. But the point was, I can now go all the way with the internet and everything else and download that material from overseas. How long would it have taken me to even know it existed if I can do a Google search and find information from other people who posted the website stuff online?
Yeah, you probably
So
wouldn't.
yeah, it wouldn't have. So it's great in that, to that extent. Unfortunately, just like with AI and Chat GPT, which is trained on data that existed, I guess it's become more current nowadays. It used to be beyond, prior to 2021. And so you realize that maybe some of that information that it was trained on wasn't even valid back then. It was just hodgepodge that was out there, and it spits it back out today. But then you and I in school, we were educated out of textbooks that were put together by scientists who were doing things long before that. So nowadays, we don't know how much of what we were trained on
It's current.
has some
Yes,
garbage
yes.
value to it to begin with. And so going on the internet, and unfortunately, to say capitalism, but the idea that we all need money to survive. And now you've got YouTube, and everybody wants to be an influencer, and you've got TikTok, and unfortunately, the TV programs that are put on. Ancient Aliens is one of the worst, in my opinion, because I'm wondering, in their script rooms where they're coming up with ideas, if somebody says, how can we merge UFOs with octopuses or octopi?
They've done that, I
Okay,
think, by the way.
yeah, that's my point. So it's like anything goes. And unfortunately, that's what people are hammered with, and they don't stop to think, okay, their purpose is not to educate. I've heard too many, I don't know if you ever used to go on YouTube videos and you see these crazy UFO videos by Third Phase of Moon.
I know who you mean. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's all garbage.
What's their last name? It starts with a C, whatever those guys were. But their point was, they defend themselves. And I've heard this said by
Secure Team 10. Is it Secure Team 10? Does that ring a bell?
yeah, the Cummings brothers, whatever their names were at the time. But the point was, even on Ancient Aliens and some of those kind of shows, they defend themselves by saying, we're just presenting the information and letting you make your own decision. Well, sure, you're going to go to school and train somebody in physics and just say, look what happens when I do this, and then let them come up with some explanation for it, and pretend that we know the whole reason they're doing it is to make money. It's all about eyeballs. Anything you do these days is about that. And so if people would stop to, the old saying, consider the source. If people would stop and decide, what's the reason this person is doing this, or this TV program, or this YouTuber is doing? And are they talking to people who were there at the time? I mean, we're left with, and I hate to even say this but it really came to heart in the last few days. Years later, the more things go by, 5, 10, 20, 30 years after the fact, it becomes so easy for more convoluted theories to come up and arguments to be made. And then you begin to think, now I can't just call up the witness and ask him, because the witness is dead.
Yep.
So I'm left looking at what other people have said, and you hear the craziest kind of things. I will give an example. The Rendlesham story, Rendlesham base, the Bentwaters case. 90% of the stuff you hear today, to put it mildly, nobody was saying that back in 1980 to 85, when it was kind of still a hot topic. You had the Halt memo, you had stories of allegedly what they saw. And then before too long, you begin to get Larry Warren's story and more stories of, well, somebody else somewhere else had a craft come down and there were creatures seen. But the basis of what began the whole Rendlesham story, Bentwater story, didn't have any of that in it. And now today you've got Peniston and a few others with books where they claim they walked up on an object with hieroglyphic symbols, and somehow he has some mental ideas of these,
Yeah,
you
the
know.
binary download or whatever.
Yeah. And I mean,
Yeah,
and if you go to look at the conferences that are out there and go look at the speaker list, and you realize how much that kind of thing sells, as long as you can stay relevant in some way, we'll get you on the speaker list, you know. But anyway,
yeah, I know where you're going with that, but would you say overall net positive or net negative these days versus years ago?
as much as I hate the net negatives, I would still say net positive, because information is power.
And I
Just
agree with you,
be
by the way.
sure you double check your information.
Yeah,
Consider where it's from and who it is.
I agree. I'm going to skip over lots of stuff and we're just going to quickly enter the Koit zone. Koit zone! Now, in the Koit zone, I'm just going to ask you random questions. So these are nothing like what we've gone through. Some of these are silly, some of these just are about you and your personality. So, what is your favorite
Great.
film? Let's start simple.
At the moment, I've
Yeah.
had several. Believe it or not, a terrific film, one I never saw, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty.
The original or the
No,
Ben Stiller one?
Ben Stiller one. I never saw it. I mean, it has given me more respect for Ben Stiller than I mean, not that I didn't have plenty of respect for him before. He has played such a wide variety of
Mm.
characters. And I'm not so sure if it's just because, as you grow older, you have far more to look back on than you have to look ahead to. And I would say for all of you younger guys, get busy. Whatever you want
Experience.
to do,
Yeah.
do it. Even if you got to, but it's just become a superb show. But I've got several that I've, down to keep on a drive that I can watch. Um, Oddly enough, some of the films that I like the most that I don't talk about, you wouldn't believe it, but are romance films. I mean, I don't know if you ever remember before Christopher Reeves was injured, he did a film called Somewhere in Time.
I know the film, yeah. It's a nice film.
Gosh,
Very nice
that's
film.
well done, based on
Oh,
the
yeah.
short story, the Pop Go Watch or something like this. Terrific one. I do a time travel kind of film that I like a lot is Tom Cruise,
Edge of Tomorrow?
um, Edge of Tomorrow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
Edge
a
of
great
Tomorrow.
film. Yeah.
That's great. And oddly enough, his new one, the new the Top Gun film with
Yeah,
Val
it was
Kilmer.
decent. I
It
love
was
that
a
one.
decent one, a real touching scene in there with the two of them. Um, Favorite films: The Revenant,
Oh, the
with Leonardo
bear attack one.
DiCaprio. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
Bear
quite
Attack.
brutal, that
That was
bear scene.
that was brutal, but
Yeah.
struggling to survive, to hang in there.
Mm.
That was a great film. Anyway, those are some of them. If I think of another one while we're
No, they're
talking
good.
here,
They are
I'll,
good
I'll
choices.
let you
Well
know.
played. I've not heard those from anyone else yet. What is your breakfast of choice?
Oh man. First thing every day starts with coffee. Although I've liked hot tea lately, believe it or not. I
Mm.
started some of that. So I'll give it to you, British. Hot tea is not bad for what that's worth. Probably if I had a choice, scrambled eggs and bacon, good
And I have to
biscuits,
ask a quick supplemental question on this because bacon is a big thing for me. Crispy or floppy?
crispy. I don't know.
You
But I
passed the
like it
test.
as long as it's bacon, but yeah, I tend to crispy it so it
Good
crunches,
work. Good work. You get big plus points for that.
That's funny.
Hey, here's one. Have you ever been attacked by an animal?
Let's see. Yeah, as a kid, bitten by dogs a few times, trying to pet the wrong dog here and there. Let's see.
Not a bear. You can't choose bear because that's Leo's.
No, honestly, at the moment, other than having been bitten by dogs a few times here and there, I can't think of an animal. Maybe a mad parakeet when I had one once in a while, they but
You've never
no,
been attacked by a giraffe or a rhino or
no, nothing worth talking about. Let's see.
that's okay.
Yeah.
We'll go with dogs. That's work. That's good. What's the best thing you've ever found? Like money or a treasure or something randomly in a field or anything?
Boy, you really come up with some tough ones. Best thing
They're the
I've
best
ever
questions.
found. It's interesting because the thought that just came to my head, I mentioned earlier that I grew up in Indonesia way back in the 60s and
Hmm.
late 50s, 60s. Back then, we'd go to Bali on the beach. There were no hotels. I mean, it was just you're on the ocean and there's the beach, and we'd get a tent and you'd camp on the beach. And if you've ever been to a store like a Pier 1 that has seashells and all that stuff in there,
Oh
well,
yeah,
back
yeah.
then, back then the beach was just full of it. It wasn't just sand; it was shells everywhere. And I remember, even as a small kid, one time looking down and seeing a shell on the beach and lifting the lid, and there was a pearl in it.
Whoa.
And I grabbed that pearl in my little hand and I ran to my mom and said, "Mom, look, I found a pearl." And I opened my hand. I'd lost it.
No.
Ah,
That's the best thing
lost
then
and
you've
found,
ever
found it.
found and
Just to
lost.
think of an actual pearl in there. And I'm sure I found bits and pieces of things here and there since then. But for some reason, to this day, that stuck with me. The idea that I could just be on a beach before tourists were there, and just flip open a little shell and find an actual. And I can remember the pearl it was a pearl.
That's
Oh,
quality.
what a lost thing to find, to have and lose, right?
Yeah, hell yeah. That's a great thing. Um, let's go slightly sideways from there. Does Bigfoot exist?
Man, that's a topic that came up recently with a friend of mine, and we may never speak again. Um, at the moment, I can't say yes or no because I don't
How
know.
do you know? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I would tend to think, though, based on some of the experiences that I've been told by people who had a clear view. I don't just mean like you see on TV, it's a bunch of trees and it's night vision and there's a shadow. But some people have looked down and saw, even one, I'll give you an example that I saw on a program, but it was some fishermen off the coast of Alaska somewhere. And they had pulled up at night in the dark off the bay, not far offshore. And they had no lights on the boat at the time, apparently, but they heard a noise. And the guy, there's, some Alaskan fisherman guy, and he had heard a noise over there on the beach, not far from where they were. And so he had a spotlight and he swung it over there. And it was the description that was so strange, the point was he was saying this was Bigfoot, but it was two of them. And as soon as the light spotted them, one of them dropped down, like crouching down, but they both froze, didn't move until he held it long enough. And finally, they got up, moved away. The idea of the one of them freezing and crouching, but he was close enough to have heard something and hit it with a spotlight. And when he hit it with spotlight, I'm going to assume, just because he knows the area better than I would have, it's hard to dismiss. It's like, in a way, it's like UFOs. You
Yeah.
ask somebody who's never had an experience and has never talked to anybody else and ask them about their experience. It's hard to convince them. That's why I say I stand by my convictions, not my beliefs, because of the people I've talked to who actually saw it, or like this guy who turned that spotlight on it and what he saw. Otherwise I could say, is it possible that there's some homeless person with a ghillie suit, or some homeless person at a distance up there wandering around where nobody expects anybody to be? I might have been able to say some of them, I might have said, but it's like the UFO pictures that don't have any wow factor. I can see it, but you're not going to prove anything by it. But in a court of law, you could put somebody on a stand and 12 jury members would believe them.
Hmm.
And you could convict somebody on that. So you cannot, unless you want to, it's your choice, arbitrarily dismiss someone who has had a close up enough experience to know what they saw, and you can hear it in their voice. We've heard that analogy
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
That I would tend to think that something like what people refer to as Bigfoot is probably out there. I'm waiting for how it gets. Now, do I think, I mean, you can equate just because there's been a UFO sighting someplace and somebody else somewhere else saw, if you go to Scotland, there have been UFO sightings. People have also seen what they call Loch Ness. Does that mean I need to lump Loch Ness in with UFOs now? No. But we have a lot of people who will tend to think just because this has been seen and that's been seen, that it automatically means it's part of the phenomenon.
Yeah.
That doesn't fly with me. I mean, but I'm not denying that it could. Could Bigfoot be flying around in UFOs? I don't know.
I don't. Yeah, I'm speaking to Stan Gordon in a few
But
months.
but my point. But
Yeah.
there's my point. I'm not going to deny outright something. I like this famous line from the old Willy Wonka movie, the first one. It says, "You should never doubt what no one is sure about." And if nobody's sure about things, it's like particle physics and quantum phenomenon. You got some scientists who've got a PhD in quantum physics. But I remember Feynman, one of the godfathers of quantum physics, who said, I think it's safe to say nobody understands quantum physics. I'm not denying quantum physics isn't a valid thing and that there's not weird phenomenon, entanglement, whatnot. So I'm not going to outright deny something just because I haven't had an experience with it. But I'm very, very cautious, and I'm certainly as I say to my friends, like I just put it on the shelf in my mind. I don't throw it away.
No,
But
it's healthy
I'm
is what
looking
it's
for
called.
hard evidence. And if nothing else, somebody needs to get it. And it may
Yes.
be out there. That guy's not making it on YouTube, or that guy's, how many farmers have seen odd things and they got a camera, they took a picture of it, but they don't talk to other people and they don't go on YouTube and they don't plant it out there. And so we don't find out until 5 or 10 years later. And then people begin to dismiss it because, well, why wouldn't he have done this or that? Or why would he? It's frustrating. I'm probably more frustrated with the people that right now, many people in ufology, than with the general public, because there was a conversation that went on, and I don't mean to run off the page here, the other day on one of the Facebook groups where somebody brought up the idea of the term UFO and UAP, and and I'm like, look, this is about, like, I think I'll paraphrase the analogy I made. This is like deciding to rename your trash can as a safe, and now assuming it's going to somehow have more value in it because you call it a safe. Doesn't matter. You can change the name of whatever you want. It's still until you define what is
What it is.
valuable.
Yeah.
And my point was, as long as the focus is on unidentified and not the object, phenomenon just means something someone saw or something intrinsically interesting. If we can't describe, at least in some way, some characteristics of what it is we're looking for, how are you going to know it when you find it? I had an analogy of a guy who goes hunting for this mysterious fish everybody's talking about. And you say, well, what does it look like? Well, nobody knows. That's why it's a mysterious fish. Well, and if you
How do you know
catch
it's a
it,
fish?
yeah. And if you catch one and you pull it up and it looks like some fish, how are you going to know if that's the one? Nobody, you've got to have some characteristics. You can't just, that's why we have orbs, because it means a fuzzy blob.
Yeah, I know you can't characterize them things.
Yeah.
I think I've got somebody coming on in a few weeks. We're going to be talking about orbs. Funnily enough, does mysterious fish exist? No, no, sorry, that's the wrong question. Wet shave or electric razor?
I have a POS electric razor right now. So I don't have, actually, I need to buy one. It's funny you mentioned that because I've been looking up to see which ones are the good ones. I think my brother sent me a link to it, but I've just got one that's bought it at a Fry's Electronics some time ago. I think it's a Vivitar, believe it or not.
I don't even
But
know
it's
what
just, but it's,
that is,
no,
but
they used to make camera lenses, and I don't know. I shouldn't have bought it. It's just a POS, but so I just use a straight razor most of the time.
fair
For
enough.
you this morning.
Get your new electric razor on your Christmas list. You never know.
Yeah.
Do you have a skill for something that is so banal, i.e., pointless, but you have it anyway?
Oh man. I don't know whether I'd call them banal skills. I mean, everybody can do Photoshop these days. I play the guitar and the keyboard, but not like I used to. I don't know whether that's a banal skill since I only play for myself.
No, that's a good skill. I
um,
like that.
Man,
keep it in the back of your mind. We'll move on.
Yeah,
What's the worst thing you've ever eaten?
man, that's a good one. By worse, I will qualify it this way. I went with my brother used to live in Seattle. So we went to a barbecue place run by some black people. It was popular, terrific food. I mean, it was one of those small, like a little hole in the wall kind of places. But at lunchtime, the line would be out the door and down the block. It's terrific. But we went in there, sat down, and on the wall were these signatures by really famous people, singers and people. But it was like, I met the man at the name of this place. I'm sure if anybody's from Seattle and they hear that phrase, I met the man. So I asked my brother, what's the man? He says, it's this hot sauce they make. I'm like, really? And sure enough, just about that time, this must have been the owner, right? This big guy comes walking around. He's got this sauce pot, a sauce pot that deep, full of this red sauce. My brother opens his mouth and says, oh, this is my brother. He's never met the man. The guy takes just a small teaspoonful and puts it on the edge of my plate. And I'm like, I've had hot sauce before. This is Texas, right? You have Hispanic food, you have everything here. So I'm like, all right, I'll try some of this stuff. Put a little bit on the side of what I was eating and eat that thing. I thought my skin was going to fall off. It was my mouth started, my brother's eating it over there. I'm seeing the perspiration rolling down his face. First thing I did was I start spreading it around on my plate to make it look like I've eaten it so I could hide it because it was the hottest stuff. I don't ever want to eat that stuff again. But I believed everybody who went there when they said, I met the man, that's what they met. They had some of that hot sauce and it was whew. I mean, I didn't even eat the whole teaspoonful. I just got a little bit on the end, put it on there, and it was enough to just burn the inside of your mouth and make me feel like, give me a fire hydrant water, anything.
Puts you off peppers for life, doesn't it?
I like, that's the thing. I like in Indonesia, you grow peppers out in the backyard, peppers all over stuff. This was a scale far beyond anything I'd ever eaten. So if I had to say the worst thing I've ever eaten, that might be it. Best thing I ever ate in Germany one time. I'd worked for American Airlines years ago. Took a flight to visit my dad in Germany in a little town called Koblenz. I mean, I love food, great food. There was this stuff called Jaeger Schnitzel, which is, I mean, everybody's heard of Wiener Schnitzel as a sausage and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I just asked the guy, I went in there, was, with my stepmother at the time, and I sat down and it was like, where is everybody? It was lunchtime. There's nobody even on the streets. The little guy that ran it was talking to some people, and I said, give me something quintessentially German. Just give me some German something so I can say I ate some real, German food here. And he made this Jaeger Schnitzel. I've never eaten it since, and I've never wanted to eat it anywhere else since because I swear it was the best stuff you could ever. I think it was just chicken, and Jaeger, I think, means chicken. It was some chicken with some kind of I don't know what, over rice. But I'm telling you, if I could find an authentic German food place that made it that way, I've never forgotten that guy. So anyway, if you ever go to Germany, find a little town called Blinz on the Rhine and go find a little place.
And have some Jaeger Schnitzel. You just reminded me of one of the times I had some super lush food, and that was in Austria, and that was chicken, but with some sort of coating on it. And that was amazingly lush, and I have not been able to replicate that since. So yeah, they're German, obviously. Yeah, so awesome. Hey ho. What's the oldest piece of clothing you own?
Oh man, I have this shirt that's got a few holes in it here and there. But since it's getting cold here now, it's a shirt that I keep for wintertime because it's an old mock turtleneck, long sleeve, way too large for me. I don't know, maybe a triple extra large for all I know. So obviously I don't wear it outside or anywhere. But it's the most comfortable thing I could possibly wear. So at night when I sleep and it's cold and I have my, put on some long sweatpants or whatever, I pull this shirt on and I'm in sleep like a rock. Now that's probably it. It's a shirt I sleep in.
And how? Sure what year? What vintage?
Well, it's old enough I can't even remember how long I've had it now. It's just I don't throw it away.
Fair enough. Did the human race arrive on Earth or evolve on Earth?
Huh. Well, I might say if I had to, my own little theoretical view of things, philosophical view of things, to some degree, you have to say we evolved because we have characteristics with some other of the animal species on this planet.
Hmm.
But I have a very difficult time. In fact, it's funny. Earlier this morning, I was reading something about the laws of thermodynamics briefly. I don't waste my time on science papers, but it went back to this idea that I've had. And that I think it's the second or third law. All things tend towards random disorder. That's just the entropy. Things tend to break down to the simplest state. And if that's the case, I mean, I'm just making this point that it's like if you throw something away or just throw it on the ground, eventually it either begins to rust or something happens, it breaks down, and
Yep.
dust to dust, however you want to word it. A Rolex watch, simply made from elements we find on this planet. Elementary metals, crystals, whatever you want to call it, things that we didn't have to create them. They were just natural minerals that were here. But a Rolex watch is nowhere near as complicated as a simple amoeba with DNA structure and everything else, let alone the human being or any life form. But if you ask somebody, how long do you think I'd have to look at the ground before a Rolex watch would pop out or evolve out of the ground?
All right. Yeah.
That was the whole idea of the laws of thermodynamics, that you don't get anything from nothing. Work has to go into something. And people might interpret that in some spiritual or faith-based, God created everything or whatever, however you want to look at it. And I'm just making the point that everything that we have got on this planet that's made out of raw materials took some thought and design and work to put work into it, to build, to create it. And we still can't create even the simplest life form. We can clone it, but to my knowledge, and I'm not trying to diminish some scientist who's working on it, nobody's found a way to take a pool of enzymes and zap it with electricity or whatever we were led to think in school, that somehow a life form just evolves from that. So to answer the question, I do think human beings over however many eons of time have evolved on this planet. But what the original impetus was, or whether we've heard asteroids, meteorites that may have come from some other long distant planets or places that may have some form of life that's frozen in there, or even and where that came from on the far side of the galaxy. I mean, where it came from there. Something tells me if you can't get something from nothing, there had to be some plan or some work or some impetus put into something that came and got to this planet, especially considering if we started out as this blob of molten lava spewing and fire tends, as far as we know, except maybe some places we don't, fire tends to destroy everything or melt it back down. Once solid ground solidified and moisture began to something, I would tend to think something probably seeded that with whatever was the spark of life, had the original genetic DNA, and then you evolve based on what you've got. Just like you and I, we are what we eat. So eventually things break and evolve from that. And there's 3 dogs in here, and I swear the smallest dog in here is the smartest dog. I've seen her grab something with her front paws and hold it. So how evolution creates a thought process that then refines itself. So, I would tend to think we may have Earth got seeded from somewhere, but don't ask me to prove it. That's just my
Mixture
thought.
of both. No, no, that's fair. Panspermia, if you will. Would you change the path of your life if you had the chance to live your life again? Or are you
Yes.
gonna, you would change
No.
it?
Yes.
Oh,
Too many. I mean, a lot of people say, don't live with any regrets. Don't do this, don't do that. And there are things, and how do you say it? People I wish I hadn't hurt. The things there's there's a saying that I've heard that I tend to believe, which is you don't learn from doing something right. You learn from doing it wrong.
Correct. Yes.
And if that's the case, then I learned quite a bit. And if I could go back and rectify, and I have a plan for a few things, but yeah, if I could go back and change some things, oh, there are plenty of things I can think of right now that I would change. And hope I got it right the next time around.
Well, yeah, as long as you're taking that back with you.
Yeah, no
Because
kidding.
if you're not, you might make the same mistakes
Yeah,
again.
can I go back and knowing what I know? That's right. Yeah.
Well, that's the key thing that everyone wants to. We're going to exit the Koit zone there, and I have one final question for you, which is, what are you currently working on? Is there anything?
I moved back to Dallas from Austin not long ago, and having been somewhat semi-retired, and this is not cutting it. So I'm going to try to find something else to do. But one of the things that I mentioned, I'd been doing some artwork earlier, was with the advent of AI and some other things. And right now I don't have a place to put up a canvas and get back to oil painting or whatever, which is what I used to do, what I like to do. And which, for whatever reason, everybody still seems to think somehow that's more valid art than something that someone creates using some of the AI and ChatGPT programs, which I played with recently, and they're fascinating. But you don't get anything on the first try, especially if you have an idea of what you want. So originally, and actually I recreated the painting, I think in my book, I was going to do it, this is years ago, way back in the late 70s, 80s. I was going to do an illustrated book on some of the best UFO sightings. But getting the facts and the details is what ground it to a halt. And I got the Socorro case done and one other case. But now I've realized that even trying to reproduce some of the better cases to make it look real, I don't want it to look photographically real, because in a way, it takes away from the feeling when you're looking at the fine details. But I do want to have the basic illustration work. That's when I mentioned the Valensole case, and I may write Jacques Vallée about this question, but the idea of trying to get the area to look correct and do it in, but anyway, the whole idea is doing some artwork that I have a website that I've put up there, called fullofstars.com. It's not UFO related art. It's just other art that I've done and photography stuff I've done, because somewhere years back, I realized nobody had actually got the name, the URL, fullofstars.com. I would have thought, why not? But when I checked it, nobody had. So I grabbed it, and I had it for years and didn't do anything with it. But I've decided, I've got some other types of art that I've done that I enjoy doing, and some of them but it takes a lot, even with AI art, to get the right sentence worded the right way to get what you in. And then so most of these things, you go through hundreds of iterations.
That's right, yeah.
Before you'll see something that you think looks good. And even then, in the past years, I've known then the hand's not perfect or the face isn't perfect. And you've got to take the time to stop and redo that. So, but the artwork aspect of it is something that I think maybe when it comes down to the UFO arena would be interesting to have, because whether you do it on, these days, people do anything. And if I can make $1 or $2 here on it because it's something that someone enjoys, that's fine. But I'm going to take my UFO art and probably put it on my Exodus publishing site where I have my book, because that's really more targeted towards the UFO side. But doing artwork is fulfilling. And
yes,
some of the stuff that AIs can come up with is just incredible, in my opinion. Some of the stuff is, even if it's a slight shift on what your idea was, and it comes up with a view of something that you would not have imagined, but it is what you were it is what you were saying. So that's exciting and interesting kind of stuff. And I have some stories I want to write. I need to get back to that have nothing to do with UFOs, other books and stories. But anyway,
I will link to your fullofstars.com in the description. And if you do start selling it, fair play to you. Good luck.
Well,
having a creative outlet is amazing.
Yeah, getting the WooCommerce stuff and getting all the website stuff takes time.
Yes.
But the Xdesk publishing, which is where I had my book on, and in fact, the whole idea of Xdesk wasn't really intended to be Xdesk. It started from when I would abbreviate X descending. XDESC, and eventually it looks like Xdesk DSC. And so then I thought, well, that's probably okay. I'll just use that. So it wasn't really intended to concentrate on the whole X unknown thing, but it worked, so I got it anyway. But anyway, so those are the two sites I'm working on, and Exodus Digital is one I want to do, but it's not available. It's not open yet. But Exodus Digital is where I want to do some documentaries, and I actually had done a trailer for a documentary on Socorro because I knew Lonnie Zamora and I talked to him, and I have his voice describing the symbol that he saw on the side of his object, which has been a bone of contention with everybody. But I've got him describing it, and he drew it for me. So coming from the eyewitness, that's about as good. But I wanted to do that. I just, getting the money for it, I don't know. Money is a touchy thing to me because I want to make sure I give something that people get what they felt like that was worth their funds.
Oh, I agree.
But I've got 3 sites. It's just the only 2 of them right now I think are up there where you can actually get to them. But that's it. Other than that, I'm sitting here getting older by the day.
I think we all are doing that one. We're all on that journey with you. Hey, listen, thank you ever so much for your time. You've been very, very gracious with it, and I really appreciate that.
I hope it's helpful to some people who are interested in the topics discussed. So
I'm sure it will. I love getting this stuff out there. I'm going to end this now, so I'm going to say goodbye to everyone. But if you can stay for one more minute of your time, I just want to ask you one final question. Thanks, everyone. Right, goodbye. To watch other KoitCast episodes, please click the image top left. To subscribe to my channel, please click the image top right. Please like and share to help KoitCast grow, and most importantly of all, please click the notification bell so you never miss an upload.